Welcome to today's Police and Crime meeting, where we will be discussing victim support in London. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode. Can I now ask our clerk, Lauren Harvey, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Duval, and we are joined by Assembly Member Clark virtually.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? No. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 6th of January 2022 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the committee? Thank you. We now move on to our main item of business, the question and answer sessions with guests on victim support in London. So I'd like to welcome our guests, Rachel Nicholas, Head of Service, London Domestic Abuse Services, Victim Support. Chris Venkateswamy, Deputy Chief Crown Prosecutor, London South Crown Prosecution Service. Claire Waxman, OBE, Victims Commissioner for London. Commander Sue Williams, Criminal Justice Lead, Metropolitan Police Service. Chief Inspector David Hobson-Smith, Deputy Lead, Responsible Officer for Victim Care Improvement of the MPS. And John Poyton, Chief Executive Officer, Red Thread. And with John, to assist him, not for us to ask questions, we wouldn't put you through that, is Jess MacDonald. Welcome all. I've been asked by the IT people, when you do speak, can you speak right into this, because we have problems hearing, and yesterday was quite difficult to hear. So I'm going to start off, everyone. Before I start the actual questioning, I would like to say that we're all clearly very concerned about the devastating IOP report which came out yesterday. I understand that none of the officers present will make a statement, and that's fine, because we will be asking the Deputy Commissioner on the 23rd. But I will say that I do think this report will not help confidence in the police, and therefore will impact on victims' views, and I think therefore it is quite pertinent for us to think about that this morning. Right, I'll start the questioning. And I'll go, first of all, to our Victims Commissioner. What, for you, has been your biggest achievement as Victims Commissioner for London, and what are your key challenges?
Just checking you can hear me okay. Is that good enough, Susan? Yeah, sure.
I think it is. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think really the biggest progress that we've been able to make is to ensure that the victim's voice and their needs and interests are being listened to, and they're being engaged with properly. When I first joined and became Victims Commissioner for London, none of the agencies that I was working with even had forums or any engagement with victims directly. And that has really changed over the last 4.5 years. The Met now have forums where they engage directly with victims over their VAWC action plan that they're working on. The Assistant Commissioner met with survivors directly. I convened that, and she met with survivors. And they're helping to influence and change work that the Met are actually putting forward. The same is with CPS. We've worked really closely with them, and I'm really pleased that they've taken on so many recommendations that I put forward over the years, namely a lot of the work that came out of the London Rape Review that was published in 2019. That rape review, that comprehensive review of rape cases in London and why so many were failing to get to court, has really laid the foundations for huge transformational change, not just in London, but nationally as well. So I'm hugely proud of that work. The Met have obviously got a lot of work to do to improve the investigation of rape, and they've taken a lot of the recommendations forward, but it's taking time to embed, and I know that there's more work that's coming out of the Met on Operation Soteria, which is from the government in their end-to-end review. they have actually devised a programme where academics have gone into forces and they've gone into the Met recently to look at why they're failing to bring so many rape cases forward. And that Operation Soteria actually came from the London Rape Review. We found that so many victims were withdrawing, and we wanted to try and understand how we could improve investigation and prosecution. And it really laid the foundations for the Project Bluestone, which were these academics that first piloted it in Avon and Somerset, and now it's become Operation Soteria under the government end-to-end review, and they've gone into the Met. So we look forward to those findings, and I hope that the Met will be accepting all the recommendations in full, because what that will do is completely transform the way rape victims are responded to, and that we will see far better and more effective investigation, more focused on suspects as opposed to the victims. What we've seen over the last few years, and it's come out of the London Rape Review, that there's far too much focus on victims, their behaviour, their credibility, and that's really impacted them accessing the right support and, more importantly, accessing justice. A lot of the recommendations from the Rape Review have been adopted and accepted by the CPS. They've changed their guidance on rape myths and stereotypes on the back of the London Rape Review, and I hope that will really change the way in which they prosecute rape cases. They've accepted a key recommendation, which is doing training on understanding the impact of trauma on memory and recall. What we identified in the London Rape Review is that victims were not getting charges on their cases, and often that was down to the police and the CPS thinking that inconsistencies in victims' accounts was somehow that they were lacking credibility, that they were lying, that they weren't telling the truth. But actually those inconsistencies in victims' account are often a product of the trauma that they've experienced from the rape, which affects their memory and recall. Sorry, can you hear me still? So yeah.
I can hear you, but I think there's a bit of an echo on it.
Yeah,
if I can ask Steve at the back, can we swap
Shall I go
microphones?
nearer?
Sorry, we notoriously have problems. Oh, poor Steve has.
No, it's fine. I
problems.
could hear an echo, so just
Yes,
checking.
no, I can. So if we can just swap your microphone.
Your microphone just a little bit away from you.
Okay, so not so near. Is that better?
Ah, yes.
Yes?
Thank you.
All right, I'll stay in this position. I
Yeah,
won't move.
highly tuned. Yes, you're going to end up in a fixed position like
Okay.
that.
And so the CPS have actually made some huge steps forward as well. But the issue that we see, and you've made the point at the beginning, that whilst we are looking at making huge progress, we are battling a cultural issue. Cultural issue definitely within the Met, and of course that sort of plays out throughout the criminal justice system, which I strongly believe is sort of deeply entrenched with misogyny and sort of anti-victim rhetoric and victim blaming, and that's something we need to still tackle. And I think that will take some years to change that culture. But as I said, that's the overriding issue I'm concerned about, that I think is denying victims the support and justice that they need.
Well, I can confirm the whole committee is concerned about that. I mean, if you look at sanction detection rates in London are very low. So how are you helping victims of all crime? I understand why you fix on some victims, and that's very understandable. But there's so many victims of crime, as in burglaries, etc., that never get justice of any description at all. Do you work with all of those thousands of people?
So I do work, well, I have a small team. There's only an office of 3, so I have to prioritise the work. But what I did in order to reach all victims of crime in London was to look at their rights and entitlements under the Victims Code of Practice. Many of the agencies within that code who are meant to be delivering those rights and entitlements, which would ensure that victims got the right response, they got a crime reference number, they were treated properly, and their cases taken forward, were really struggling to access those rights and entitlements. So we led a huge and the most comprehensive review ever done of the Victims Code of Practice that was published in 2019. And key recommendations came out of that, not just for London, but also it helped the government when they refreshed their Victims Code of Practice, which came out on the 1st of April last year. The problem we have with that code still is there's very poor awareness of victims' rights and entitlements, and the government is currently consulting on a victims law. And so what I hope we will drive forward is a lot of the learning we've picked up in London and through the Victims Code of Practice review, and to see it firmly put into legislation victims need legally enforceable rights to help them access justice and support. That's for all victims. When a victim becomes a victim of crime, they need to know what their rights are so they can hold the police and other agencies to account if it isn't delivered. Sorry, can you still hear me or not? No.
Chair, I think there is something wrong with the
Yeah,
mic. If I'll
Steve's-
take to
Yeah,
fix it.
Steve
Thank
is
you.
just
Thanks.
about to change. That's all right. There. I'm sure that's going to be fine.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Fine.
We'll put that one in the bin, I think. I must ask the. Sorry, you saying?
No, I can't hear you so well now. Are you?
Oh dear. Okay, we're going to adjourn for 5 minutes while the whole lot are reset. I apologise to everybody. Apologies, everybody, for that, because we heard a very good account from our Victims Commissioner on all the work being done. I hope that you managed to pick up a lot of that. So if I just say to Claire Waxman, can you very, very briefly say how you work with the Met and other criminal justice partners to support victims, but if you could keep it short, and we'll make sure what you said before is put out there anyway for people to read.
Thank you. So I work directly with the Met, CPS and other partners through the justice process. I identify and challenge, identify any barriers that victims and survivors of all crime types are facing when they're trying to access the justice process. And I bring those to all the partners through my victims board, and we raise those issues there. I also work more directly with the Met, their victim care team, who are here today, on how we improve awareness of the Code of Victims' Rights and Entitlements and how we improve the Met's response to victims. And so we do a lot of engagement. We bring survivor feedback to them, and then I also help the Met with developing victim care leaflets and how they're distributed, because I want every victim, when they report a crime, to get that leaflet and to be made aware what their rights and entitlements are so they know what to push for. I also want to make sure they have access to the right support, so it's really pushing the Met on increasing their referrals to support services like the LVWS, the London Victim Witness Service. And then I work with CPS. We've done a lot around their communication with victims, how they respond to victims. They've got consultants that have been in recently that I've worked with on improving their communication to victims, how it can be more trauma-informed, understanding impact of trauma. So, yeah, I have a very close working relationship with all of them throughout the justice system.
Lovely, thank you. So can I come to Commander Sue Williams? Can you say how you think the Victims Commissioner has changed how the Met supports victims?
Yes, well, thank you very much for inviting me here today to talk on behalf of the Met. And for more detailed information, I've got David, who's here, because he's more of our... I've got a strategic overview that I'll represent, but David's got more precise information if you want to dig into some of the things we're actually doing. But it's really been useful having a Victims Commissioner, because whilst we do have processes to speak to victims, not all victims will speak to police, as you can well imagine. And having somebody more independent with their own victim forum is able to be a bit of a bridge between policing and victims. And it's a two-way process. So we will work with Claire and some of her team, and her team, her policy advisor, will come to some of our victim care meetings and tell us and advise and support us with some of the work and initiatives that we've been doing as well.
Okay, that's lovely. David, can you give us just an area that you know this is helping in more than any other areas, if you like?
Yes, certainly. So among the projects we're working on is a project to survey victims of high harm offences. At the moment, we've the user satisfaction survey, which surveys victims of volume crime, but misses out those victims of the crimes that cause most harm. Through Claire, her policy officer, and her victims reference group, we've consulted on an appropriate question set that identifies key outcomes that we can take action on, identifies the experience of the victim, and crucially avoids re-traumatizing people through asking questions that may open them up to relive an experience in a way that's going to harm them in a home environment. She's been very keen on this project, and this project is one that we have approved just this January, and MOPAC are currently creating the IT systems for.
Okay. I mentioned before your sanction detection rates in London are so low now. What about all the victims that just don't get any justice at all? Do you have a way of dealing with victims of burglary and all of the general things that wouldn't really normally be seen as victims, but they are?
So every victim is entitled to their rights under the Victims Code of Practice, and every victim should be informed of those rights by ourselves. Claire briefly mentioned the victim information leaflet that we designed. It's an e-leaflet that goes electronically to all victims. In fact, I should clarify that should go electronically to all victims, and as yet we're still working to drive that delivery up. The importance of it is that victims are told the rights they have, they're told what they can expect within an investigation. It's not a conclusive document, it's designed to be a leaflet to signpost people to that support. And that again was designed was in consultation with LVWS, with the CPS, and crucially with Claire and with her victims reference group.
Okay, thank you. I want to ask a question of victim support and red thread. So if I start with Rachel Nicholas, how has the Victims Commissioner made a difference, and what areas do you think she should prioritise going forward?
Thank you very much. So my specific interest within the London and Victim and Witness Services in relation to domestic abuse. So I know most, that's where I have my biggest set of knowledge really in relation to the impact that the Victims Commissioner has had. I would say that having a Victims Commissioner in London has enabled us to really focus on these really high harm crimes. And also that means that we've not just focused on them in terms of legislation, but also about reviewing exactly what is happening on the ground with support services. And also it has enabled us to think about actually where the resource, which is limited always, goes. And I think that's where we've seen the big difference. And also really bringing to fore the victim's voice through all agencies that work with and try and support victims of crime. So that's more generally, but also in terms of domestic abuse.
Okay, thank you. And John?
Thank you very much for inviting me to the meeting. Red Thread has, for some time now, been supported by the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime to support young people who come to hospitals as victims of violence, and the majority of those have been young men. The focus that the Victims Commissioner is able to then bring to MOPAC's funding of our work is to really enable us to understand where young women have been perhaps falling through the gaps in statutory services. And so over the last few years, MOPAC has been able to fund a focus around bringing IDVAs in to focus on those young women and those who identify as women who are victims of domestic violence, perhaps not hitting the thresholds that traditionally commissioned services deliver. And in the last few years, it's been really helpful to be able to develop a young women's service for those young people who are presenting in hospitals, perhaps not yet willing or able or aware that of what the rights they have as a victim, but are presenting with extra-familial harm. So again, not hitting the thresholds for traditional statutory domestic violence, but extra-familial harm, perhaps gang exploitation, criminal child exploitation and sexual exploitation. So having the Victims Commissioner's focus on violence against women and girls has really enabled the health system, hospital A&E departments across London, particularly for us in St George's Hospital, King's College Hospital, St Mary's Hospital, 3 of the 4 major trauma centres, and also Homerton in Hackney. We have young women's workers who are meeting the needs of young people when they present, both as victims reporting sexual violence, but also those who aren't, again, presenting specifically as victims of assault, but who are presenting with mental health crises or illness or substance misuse, but where if there is a young women's worker or service supporting the doctors and nurses triaging and treating those young women, we're able to identify more victims who otherwise are so often flying beneath the radar, as it were.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, we'll be asking a lot more questions as we go along, but I'll finish this section shortly. If I can go back to you, Claire, the last published minutes of the London's Victims Board for a meeting held in February 2021, was that the last time the board met?
No, the board meets every quarter, and we recently met about 2 weeks ago. So there are minutes from every Victims Board meeting. But they're the last published. I wouldn't know why they're the last published, because we meet every quarter.
Well,
and we even had an extra Victims Board meeting as well around the Victims Bill consultation and the PCC.
That is good news, but it's bad news that for this
that
meeting
someone's not publishing it. I'll pick that up.
from...
That's obviously an administration issue, but
Well,
that I wasn't aware of. So thank you for bringing that to my attention.
Yeah, if you could look into that, because we can question you on things that we read, but if they're not published,
absolutely.
we can't. How many victims do you think, Claire, that you've helped or have benefited from your work in London?
I think it's impossible to put a number on it, because the pieces of work that I've done, the research that I've done that's engaged thousands of victims, would have an impact on countless victims. I wouldn't be able to give you a number. My office isn't set up, obviously, to do casework, but we do hear from victims and survivors directly through the Victims Commissioner's inbox, and we respond to all of them. We signpost them to support, and more often than not, I often do have to get involved, because I'd rather troubleshoot issues on their case than them actually, fail justice, not get justice and support. So I'll pick it up with whatever agency is failing them and troubleshoot it and make sure it gets back on track. But obviously it's impossible to put a number on it, because, the London Rate Review, the Victims Code of Practice, and all the other pieces of work. I've done huge survivor consultation for the first Mayor's VORG strategy and for the next VORG strategy that we publish soon. And so we pick up lots of issues, and we, put forward recommendations that will make changes. So it's impossible to put a number on it, but it will be countless victims and survivors, I'm proud to say.
Okay. We're now moving on to victim satisfaction, and the questioning will start with my colleague, Assembly Member Devonish.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm going to start with the Commander and the Chief Inspector from the Met, if I can. Good morning. What are you doing about the continuing decline in victim satisfaction? And are you linking this reversing the fall in sanctions detections?
Okay, so I'll start with victim satisfaction. So our last quarter had a slight upturn to 67%. I know it's not great, but there has been a slight upturn. When we look at some of the satisfaction over the previous year, there's a correlation with the absenteeism from our side because of COVID and not being able to answer the calls as quickly within METCC, and having the resources to be able to go to every single call where the victim wants to see someone and fulfill within the telephone unit, which we call the TDIU, so the on-call areas as well. So it has taken a dip last year, there's no doubt about that. There's a huge amount of work to be done, and the work of the high harm survey that David has talked about is really important, because that's going to capture some of our most vulnerable victims out there, so that we can ensure that we do meet their needs. And we have been working on a vulnerability needs assessment that we've piloted, and that has been quite successful, but we're refining it, and we're hoping to put that out again for another pilot to ensure that we get that right. Because if we can identify the needs of the victim, then we support them, and then hence their satisfaction in policing will go up. So there is more work going on locally. So within the BCUs, we have single points of contact. So there are what we call SPOCs. They're in every single BCU. They work with David and his continuous improvement team. They are the people on your boroughs or your BCUs who will be doing projects and initiatives to build satisfaction locally with the victims of crime, whether that's burglary victims or violent crime victims or domestic abuse. So there is an awful lot that goes on locally, and I would say that if any of you get the opportunity that want to know what is going on in your local borough, then please contact your BCU commander, and they will facilitate meeting the single points of contact or coming down to some of their initiatives, so you can see what they're trying to do locally. In terms of sanction detections, so It is, though, we know in the Met that we don't achieve the sanction detections that we would like to see in every single crime to bring that justice for the victim. But what we don't talk about is outcomes. So we do have out-of-court disposals and different outcomes that serve supporting the victim in a different way. So not every victim wants to go through a criminal justice system and go to court and give evidence. We know that, but there are other areas, other ways that we deal with what we call out-of-court disposals. So we have community resolutions, we have conditional cautioning, we have warnings of sort, we work with young offenders as well, so that we try to reduce the disproportionality in some crimes by diverting young people through divert prosecution schemes or other initiatives. So when you see sanction detections and we just talk about charge and caution, there is an awful lot of other things that are going on. And the new crime and sentencing bill that will come out will introduce a two-tier framework. And we're currently working on that at the moment on how to deliver that for the organisation. It doesn't come into place until next year, but it will, in effect, it will have a community caution as well as a diversionary caution. So diversionary caution is sanction detection, and a community caution is something more in line to the community resolution, but we will still keep those. So we will still be able to offer different outcomes to the victim. And with victims that don't necessarily want to go to court or get into the criminal justice system, and we know for lots of different reasons people don't want to do that, we do work with civil remedies. So we do look at, can we give the person a domestic violence protection order, a stalking harassment order, sexual harm orders. There are lots of different civil legislation out there that we're trying, and I've worked with Dave and his team to produce a whole sort of format toolkit that we can give to the officers to say, in some instances, this might support the victim in the interim period while we're investigating, or for those victims that don't want to go to court or don't want to be involved in the system, we can still protect them because there's other things that we can do. So we are working to be able to do that. And of course, we do a lot of work in partnership for referral schemes. So where we have victims or offenders who live chaotic lifestyles, we will try to support them with appropriate referral schemes to help them as well. And we do have joint working action plans that we work with around domestic abuse, rape and serious sexual offences. We're working with the CPS on joint initiatives where we're trying to support the victim at the heart of what we're doing when we provide a criminal justice outcome. So I don't know if you want to know a little bit more detail.
Well, I think it would be quite useful to have some, detail on the specific actions you're taking. You've mentioned quite a few things then. I need to ask you probably the most difficult question for you to answer today, which is when can we expect the satisfaction rates to go up again?
Yeah, that's a question we always ask ourselves. We can see it is going up the last quarter. It has started to go up, but you've got to run satisfaction over 3-6 month period to make sure that it is a trend on increasing and not just a spike for 1 or 2 months that has had that. But we do monitor very closely. We've broken down satisfaction so we know the areas of satisfaction that work for victims. We've been giving a leaflet to victims of crime. It's a really comprehensive leaflet, and I would say that if you get an opportunity to have a look at it on our website, go and have a look at it. It's got lots of information there. Where we give that leaflet to victims of crime, we have an 80% satisfaction. So that does work, but not all victims get it, and we know that there is an issue with our telephone reporting system, online systems, that although we put the links in there, we can't guarantee anybody will physically get hold of that or be directed in there by themselves to go and look at that. But
is that on your social media? Because most normal people don't actually look on a website.
Yeah. So we've got at the back there is we've got these sort of like little QR codes so people can pick it up with their phone. We have done some work with our media and comms to be able to advertise it as well. But that's the work that David's team have been doing, and it is proving to be successful. we can see we get a high satisfaction rate with people that have seen that leaflet. It's just we've got to encourage more people. And we have something like over 700,000 crimes a year, so it's an awful lot of victims out there, although we only do the satisfaction survey on distinct acquisitive crime, and we're now looking at the more violent crime for the high harm cases where we can get into victims to support them and their needs. If you want to bring David in, he can tell you a little bit more about what we're trying to do to improve satisfaction rates. Thank you.
Thank you, Mum. So, yeah, further to what the Commander has spoken about, we've had some serious analysis done on the information we get back from user satisfaction survey at present. Bearing in mind, we sort of admit we have to understand that that is a limited pool of victims, because at the moment we are only taking it from the particular crime types. So we're hoping when the high harm survey follows this up to have a more comprehensive data set, a better understanding of victims. But the key findings are probably things that won't come as any surprise. People are significantly more satisfied when they feel that their report was taken seriously, when they feel reassured by the police officers that they spoke to, and when they feel that the police officers communicated with them quickly and clearly and offered information without asking. I imagine that's no surprise to anybody, and our aim here is that those officers understand that these are the key things, the small things, giving someone information, talking to them, making sure they understand when they communicate. We've talked about the leaflet. The leaflet is extremely valuable. Our data shows that people who receive it report they're significantly more satisfied with our actions, significantly more satisfied with the explanation of the next steps in the investigation, and they have a better understanding of the offer of support from victim support. This is data, again, that we've sort of drawn from the Mayor of London's, drawn from MOPAC's user satisfaction survey. So the way we've used this is firstly in training. So in basic training for our initial recruits, this was all revised when the new Victims Code of Practice came in April to make that training reflective of the current Victims Code of Practice and to understand from a victim's perspective, these are the key themes to facilitate a victim's most positive journey through the criminal justice system. We have ongoing training for our officers who are out of their initial 2-year probation, continuous professional development. And my team have created video training that can be sent out along with question and answer sessions. So each BCU has access to this training, these videos, can review it and can ask specific questions related to their local area and the people that live there.
Okay, I'll move on to my next question. Two of my colleagues are going to come in after me, but my point would be, I think you're talking a lot about process and not an awful lot about culture, but I'm sure my colleagues will pick that up. Moving on to Claire, what measures from your perspective are being taken to identify and address the disproportionality in victim satisfaction and access to support, please?
So I've actually led a number of engagement forums and roundtables with Black victims of crime, Black female victims impacted by VORG, migrant survivors, those affected by honour-based crime, to try and identify what issues they are facing when trying to access justice and why they're not satisfied when they come forward. And a lot of the learning is being picked up in the new VORG strategy that we published in March. But also, the Mayor's got an action plan around tackling disproportionality, and a lot of the issues I'd actually take directly to the Met as well. So it's about what we pick up is when we work with Black victims is that they don't have that trust and confidence to come forward. And that's something that the Met, I know, are trying to tackle. They don't feel that they'll be treated fairly if they came forward to report. And those that do come forward and report do talk about feeling that there is prejudice and bias towards them, and they will withdraw from the process. So these are things that we must tackle. I want to pick up, if I may, just on your last question around victim satisfaction. because I want to have a very honest, I think we need to have an honest conversation. You know, I've been working with the Met for over 4.5 years, and there are some dedicated people there. I work really closely with the victim care team, and we've devised the victim leaflet, which I know will make a difference to victim satisfaction. The issues that we have is it's just not being disseminated to the front line. So I'll hear from victims, ask if they got their victim information leaflet. More often than not, they didn't. It's hugely frustrating for me because I'm working really hard with the partners to make these improvements. And what is very clear is that due to volumes of caseloads and the amount of work that the police have to do, and also the culture, there is a culture issue that we have to recognise. I don't honestly believe that the police are able and equipped to be able to give the response to victims that they need for us to really see a change in that victim satisfaction. It's why one of my key recommendations from my work, and something I really want to push forward, is that we need to have a victim care hub model for London so that victims can access a care hub model that is designed to meet their needs, to work with them, to handhold them and take them through a very complex justice process. And that they are getting a trauma-informed response and support as well. And I'm, as much as I work really closely with the Met, and as I said, there's real dedication at some levels, I'm not confident that the Met are able to deliver what I need to be delivered to victims in order to improve satisfaction.
Can I just ask, do you think that the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor get that?
Yes, they do. So much so that the Mayor put it in his manifesto commitment to look at this victim care hub. He's had consultants come in that are working with the Met to look at how do we enable this victim care hub model. It's quite a difficult, I mean, we might need legislative change, so we've got the opportunity of the Victims Bill, because under the Victims Code, it is very much the responsibility of the police to deliver a lot of those rights and entitlements to the victims. So as much as I'd like to see independence, I'm going to have to work with the government and look at legislative change to really develop what I believe, because I hear from victims and survivors all the time, they just want an independent person outside of the criminal justice system that is there for them, to help them and support them through a very difficult, traumatic and complex justice process that is hugely delayed as well now. So yeah, we have the answer, but it's just how we get to actually embedding that and enabling that.
Well, thank you for all that you're doing. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. If I can start off by asking you, Commander. So yesterday's a shocking report by the IOPC into Operation Hutton outlined, amongst other atrocious comments by officers, quote, jokes, unquote, about rape, and officers appearing to condone or even promote domestic abuse. What have you got to say on behalf of the Met to the victims of rape and domestic abuse across London? And how are you working to regain their trust and reassure them that the Met is there to protect them and can be trusted?
Sorry. I think I got most of what you're saying. Sorry. My hearing is a little bit difficult. So in terms of domestic abuse, we have just rolled out Domestic Abuse Matters, which is a nationally approved training for our frontline officers. So we've been working with Safe Lives, and we've had victims who have come down, who have been part of that training, so that they can explain to the officer what it is that they feel as a victim of domestic abuse, what the officers need to look at, how they need to delve into some of the domestic abuse situations so that we get the best out of it in terms of they understand the whole nature of domestic abuse, whether it's familial or partnership, that they can put the best possible evidence together and the best support that they can give to victims. And we know that there have been, we do get repeat victims of domestic abuse, and we work very closely with our public protection teams and partnerships to be able to, we flag up every repeat victim, and when we have a repeat victim comes to notice, we work with the local partnerships around what we call our MAREC teams, so the multi-agency risk assessment teams, and they then have that conversation about how do they support in partnership somebody that has come to notice on 2, 3, 4 occasions for domestic abuse. And as I said before, some of it is chaotic lifestyles, Some of it is about how do we deal with a violent offender, that we can, we've got new predatory offender units now within public protection, so we can task accordingly to support that particular victim of domestic abuse. We also ran some training around adverse child experiences, ACEs, and trauma training a couple of years ago. And the officers found that very useful because it gave them an insight into what the victim might be feeling, so they can see it from the victim's point of view. So we're trying to give some tools to our officers so that they understand what domestic abuse or serious sexual abuse might be prevalent when they go to an incident, so that they can support the victim in the best way. And also, with a lot, violence is our big priority. So how do we support victims of violence, particularly young victims, so that they don't go on to cause an injury to someone else or have an injury on themselves. So we're doing a lot of work supporting our officers to understand the underlying issues, but working with victims in the community to come into the training sessions and tell them what it's like. And some of that I've been doing in the criminal justice world. So we've been supporting, like, as the case goes through, you mustn't lose sight of the case and supporting a victim through what sometimes can be a very lengthy process. And we've been working on all different ways of supporting victims with victim apps, criminal justice apps. A part of our website is put over to how to improve criminal justice case files so that we get the best out of it, and working with CPS colleagues. And we're inviting victims to tell their stories to officers so that the officers see it from the victim's point of view. And we found, having worked with Claire and some of her team and the victim care boards that David runs, that working with victims and telling their stories is really impactful on our officers, so that they understand and they can give the best possible service to improve that satisfaction. So I hope in that I've answered some of the questions.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And as the chair very rightly pointed out at the beginning of the session, that we're not going to be discussing the IOPC report today. And you're not the right person in that sense to answer some very fundamental questions. But I've got to ask you this, Commander, and I know from your work in East London, you're based in Tower Hamlets, I know of your own personal commitment to tackle domestic abuse, but do you want to take this opportunity to apologize to the victims of rape and domestic abuse across London after what we've heard, after what we now know is in the IOPC
Assembly
report?
Member Desai, that this will be taken up with the Deputy Commissioner. I don't think it's right to ask officers to do this. I did make that clear in the pre-meet. We will absolutely bring it up with the leadership of the Met. We're all absolutely appalled, but I don't think it's very appropriate to ask the Commander.
I hear you. As the next chair of this committee, I respect what you're saying, so I will not pursue that line of questioning
Thank you.
anymore. So, Commander, again, whistleblowing clearly played an important role in exposing the wrongdoings within this unit, and the bravery of officers who did the right thing and reported their colleagues must be commended. I have, however, recently received data that shows a drop in the use of the Met's internal whistleblowing system, Rightline, which I think is called Rightline, in recent years. Does this need to be rectified? And do you agree that whistleblowing needs to be strengthened across the Met and the whole of policing?
Sorry, did you say our internal right line?
Yeah, there's been a drop in the use of the Met's internal whistleblowing system called Rightline.
Yeah, so we're talking about cultures and behaviours in the organisation. Which goes back to what the chair said, that there. I mean, what I will say, and there's, we've made no, not hidden any of this, but we've been working over the last 6 months, talking to all our staff on the front line and right the way through the organisation. So we call it cascade conversations. So, from very senior, talking to our senior leadership teams, talking to
sorry, I think your microphone's... It's on, but it's not working. We are having a terrible IT day. But never mind, we'll swap that microphone. There we go.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
All good.
The only thing I was going to say is there's we've not hidden anything. We're having conversations all the way through the organisation, from the very top right the way down to every single member of staff, talking about what the priorities are in terms of violence against women and girls, against violence in general, against improving trust and confidence, against working with victims to support them. It's in our Met direction that supporting a victim and bringing offenders to justice. So those conversations have been had from the very top to the right to the bottom, to make sure that everybody knows. And the question about the right line is that there is a right line, and one of the things we say in those conversations, if you're not happy or you see a behaviour you're not happy with, then you tell someone anonymously or you tell a supervisor. We're very clear on that.
Okay, so I've got two more questions, Chair, and I'll try to be brief. My next question is both to yourself, Commander, and to Claire. We already talked about sanction detections, and as I understand, in the last few months, sanction detection rates have gone up. I understand by about 20% since August, a small rise, but nonetheless a welcome rise. Do you expect, are you hopeful that this will be sustained? There are new officers, as I understand, who obviously need to be trained, but do you expect this rise in sanction detection to continue? And obviously that has an impact on the overall victim satisfaction levels.
Yes, so from our performance board, a lot of conversation has been discussed about how do we improve our sanction detections. I talked about out-of-court disposals and other outcomes. So, you know, there's always other things that are available and supportive to victims other than sanction detections. But we have been focusing on sanction detections, and there's a lot of activity, and we call it like surge activity to support officers to ensure that outstanding offenders are arrested. So we have, well, I've set a very ambitious reduction target for my officers because I've got offender management, and they've reduced offender management, those people wanted, by over 27% at the moment. So by arresting some of those people, we'll be able to then deal with their cases, charge them, and get them before a court as appropriate. So there is a lot of work and activity. We hope it's sustainable because it's really important that where people should be charged and go before a court, that they are, and they're done so as quickly as possible. And we know, and this is my point I've always made, people that are wanted can be harmful people. They can be very violent people, and we need to arrest them as quickly as possible. So we're very focused on that at the moment, and we've put a lot of resources into it, and I hope that that will be sustained.
Thank you for that answer, Commander. Claire, do you have any observations to make?
If I could just add on to that, because whilst it's welcome to see the increase in sanction detections, we have to look at the wider justice system, because there will still be failings for victims. As much as we want them to come forward and report, we want their cases dealt with swiftly, and obviously for there to be charges and to go forward to court. We have huge Crown Court backlogs in this country, and London is disproportionately impacted. And so I just want to make the committee very much aware that, victim satisfaction and victims being able to cope and recover and to get justice, we have to tackle what's going on in London with the courts. We need increased court capacity, we need increased judicial capacity, and we need it urgently. So I just wanted to, to raise that, because we're focused very much on the police, and I understand with this committee, but if we're looking truly at victim support and satisfaction, we've got to look at the entire justice journey.
Thank you. And my final question again to you.
As quick as you can, please.
Yeah, my final question again to you, Claire. We already talked about victim satisfaction, but my question is this. The victim satisfaction data published on the MOPEC website is useful, but if I may say so, crude, in the sense it doesn't give us an insight into the satisfaction of victims for different crime types. So does victim satisfaction in response to crimes such as rape and sexual assault, where we know outcomes are currently so poor, contribute significantly to the low overall satisfaction recorded in London? does there need to be better recording of the satisfaction of victims in response to different types of crimes in general? I mean, you talked about the rape review, but can you just give us your general sort of thoughts?
David was talking about the high harm survey, and that's been developed because there's been a gap in the user satisfaction survey, because I really pushed very hard and the Met weren't keen at the beginning to include domestic abuse victims, and I said it's absolutely critical that we hear from domestic abuse victims, because we need to understand where they're being failed, where they're not satisfied, and the same with rape victims, to identify what those issues are, which will help the Met obviously perform more effectively and respond to the needs of those victims. So that is being picked up in the high harm survey, and then that's why I focused a lot of my work on VORG and around rape and domestic abuse, to really try and understand what those issues are, why so many are withdrawing from the process, and to identify why they're withdrawing, and again feeding that back to the Met and the CPS on what work needs to be done to keep victims engaged in the process.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just to confirm, we are well aware of the problems with the courts, and I have actually written to the government on behalf of the committee regarding that, so we're well aware of that.
Thank
Assembly
you.
Member Russell, are you coming in?
I'm happy to leave it, Chair, in the interest of getting on with the meeting.
I'm
I'll
very grateful. Thank
wrap
you
mine
very
up
much.
in my next batch.
Thank you. Assembly Member Ahmed, did you want a very brief point?
Yes, if I may, Chair, thank you very much. Good morning, panel. Commander, I was a little bit perturbed with some of the things that you were saying with regard to the website and the leaflet, and there seemed to be a huge emphasis on this. You talked about an 80% satisfaction rate. Is that 80% of the people who have engaged with that process, or is that 80% of victims?
No, that was about people where we've been able to give them the leaflets. So we look at who had the leaflets, and then the people that had the leaflets, what was their satisfaction? And we can see that their satisfaction is considerably higher. So there's a correlation there. If we can get that leaflet out to as many people as possible, because it's got so much valuable information in there. It's got support networks.
Sorry, I've got short time before the Chair throws something at me. I'd like to ask you something very important. You quite rightly said the initiatives that you're taking are important, and we need to garner that information. How accessible are things like the leaflet? How accessible are things like the website? A leaflet, if somebody can't read it, if they have, English is very much their second language, third or fourth language, and they are a victim of crime, that is not something that they're going to be engaging with. So what is in place to ensure that those people and those victims can actually respond to what you want them to respond to?
Yeah, you're quite right. There are people that wouldn't necessarily have access, whether it's to social media or through vulnerabilities, wouldn't necessarily have the skills to be able to have that leaflet and be able to take it on. And I know David's itching to come in because he's done a bit of work around this. So
Thank you, ma'am. So the leaflet is available in translation. I believe we have it in the low 50s of languages. So the full range of languages that are used in our custody rights and entitlements, as well as additional languages that were recommended by MOPAC that weren't considered in that list. So any officer from their job laptop or device is able to search victim leaflet and the language they require. If someone needs a language beyond those, then we can make a request of our Language and Cultural Services Department for an additional translation, which will then be stored alongside everything that we have. So if someone speaks any of those 50 languages, we can provide a leaflet to them. If they speak a language less commonly spoken in London, then we can provide an initial translation through our translation service, either a translator in person or telephone, and we can provide a written translation. It will take a little bit more time for our cultural services to obtain that through a translator.
And if you're directing people to the website and asking people to engage with the website, what support would somebody have? If thinking about somebody like my mum, who wouldn't have a clue on how to get onto a website, how to actually access that information, how to then input information, what support is there for them to be able to do that?
So specifically for the leaflet, it's available in hard copy as well.
Okay,
but every one of our BCUs has a stock of hard copy, and it can be printed out again.
Okay, what about the websites?
So-
The commander was saying that quite a lot of people engage via the website, and I've given you examples of why
Yes.
people might not, and victims might not be able to engage via the website.
So for those that can't engage via the website or that prefer not to, obviously the gold standard is face-to-face engagement with an officer when someone reports a crime. We still have telephone contact. We can still make contact with someone. We always try to obtain, if someone reports an offence, what their preferred means of contact is, and then we will engage with them through their preferred means of contact wherever possible. Obviously, if we need to get a message urgently, we will use whatever means of contact we need to get a message to somebody. But that would be how we reach out, as well as directing them towards services such as LVWS, who again have telephone as well as online provision and face-to-face provision.
Okay, Commissioner, is that enough?
Well, as we said, there are issues with getting that leaflet out, which is a great initiative. We know it improves victim satisfaction. So trying to work with David and his team to ensure that every victim gets that leaflet in whatever format they need it in order to understand what their rights and entitlements are and what support is available. So, there's still a lot of work to do, really, to make sure that happens.
Is there more that can be done beyond the leaflets and the website?
Yeah, I mean, and that's the idea behind the Victim Care Hub. What needs to be done? What really needs to be done is that when a victim comes forward, there's someone working on their behalf, because it's quite a lot of information for a victim to take in. The leaflet, whilst it's great because everything's in one place, we're dealing with very vulnerable people who are suffering from trauma. To try and take in a lot of information at that time, it's very difficult.
Yeah,
so that's why I want to push this Victim Care Hub, because I want someone to do it on their behalf. I want that hub model, case companion, whoever it is, advocate, to work on behalf of that victim. They don't need to worry. We'll make sure you get your rights the whole way through. We'll make sure you get the right response and treatment, and we'll signpost you to the right specialist support to help you in your cope and recovery. That's the ideal.
Rachel, I can see you wanted to comment on that.
Yes, thank you very much for bringing me in here. I think one of the things that the London Victim and Witness Service does, and it's been a little bit hampered by the pandemic, but we've started this work up again, which is about community engagement. And it's about going out into the communities where people are. We've done some recent work with the British Transport Police in being at stations and basically engaging with people in order to help them understand what their rights are around the Victims Code practice. So I think that's a way to get into those communities, and also having linking up as part of the LVWS. We also have organisations such as Sister Space, Gallop and Stay Safe East, who work with people who actually can also make sure that their particular communities have access to this really vital information.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, colleagues, we are running well over, as you can imagine, so if we can keep answers slightly shorter if possible, I'd be grateful. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank you very much. It's been a really interesting discussion so far, but I want to move on to the courts and ask Chris whether you could come in here. The CPS, I think, announced a 5-year blueprint for the prosecution of rape and serious sexual offences back in July 2020. Can you give us an update on progress with that 5-year plan and what have you achieved so far?
Okay, good morning, Chair. Thank you very much for that question. In relation to the CPS, as you rightly noted, we launched the RASO, the Rape and Serious Sexual Offences Plan Strategy back in 2025. For 2025, we launched it in July. It's a strategy setting out a number of issues that we have been tackling. And first of all, the key one was in relation to refreshing our legal guidance for prosecutors, including tackling myths and stereotypes, as Claire Waxman has alluded to earlier. Considerable work's been done in that sphere, reflecting also changes in sexual behaviours and encounters, such as dating apps, etc. To take that to what's going on to prosecutors who are absolutely aware of this. Secondly, there were issues about launching training for prosecutors involved in the neurological impact of trauma and memory. So as again, in Claire's rate review, which was published last year, the CPS, both areas, London South and London North, welcomed the recommendations, and we are taking that forward with the Met, who we do have really close working relationships at all levels. So the other issue is about, we do accept, and I think we've said this on a number of occasions, we accept the number of rape cases going to court are incredibly low. The stark drop in the cases that have gone before a jury in recent years mean that victims are not seeing justice, and closing the gap is an absolute priority for the CPS, and we're all working hard to try to change that by making improvements in how we manage our cases. So one of the key issues we have joint national action plans, but we reflect that in London as well with the Met, and we have a joint action plan which I and others hold the Met and ourselves to account on progress of where we've got to. One of the key issues for us working with the Met was about ensuring that we're working very closely with ISVAs. We have workshops twice a year now to make sure that we're getting the input. And we've talked about community engagement. Rachel mentioned that. We're doing that locally as well. I've led on that on a number of occasions. I was the lead for hate crime for over 4 years. So I met with a wide group of the community to talk about the work we're doing, how they can contact what the CPS is doing. But also, we're also working very closely with the police about, we've signed off a memorandum of understanding about early investigative advice, so making sure that when there are rape cases, when the police are trying to build the cases, that we're all working together to ensure that the strongest possible cases are coming to us and built in a time that then doesn't result in further delay while we work for further evidence to come, so we can actually get the cases on as soon as we can. Of course, we've already alluded to the fact about the delays in the court, backlogs, etc. Some of the work we're doing there, so just let me mention very briefly, if you mind. We are working very closely with the courts about triaging cases. So where we've got young victims, vulnerable victims, Claire and others do contact us quite regularly to remind us about cases that we need to actually try and prioritise. There is a Section 28 measure which will allow victims the facility to be able to be examined in chief and cross-examined without actually being at court. So this is actually quite an important initiative. It's been rolled out across London. It's not everywhere at the moment. It's only sadly in a number of courts, Kingston and Isleworth. But having said that, it will be rolled out, and that will have a major impact and support victims. Doesn't mean the trials will come on any quicker, but it means the trauma and the impact on the witnesses, hopefully, is to some extent maybe slightly reduced. The other thing that we are doing in London, London South, was one of the pathfinder areas, Operation Soteria, which involves working very closely with police partners. It's about testing a number of ways of working in the field of RASO, well, serious sexual offences. And what we are trying to look at is to see what model works best for us. So we've obviously been guided by the academic research that the Met conducted, the Bluestone academic research. We have our own nationally, we're a national organisation, so the CPS has instructed an academic to have a look at the work that we're doing, what improvements can we make to ensure that we get the best outcomes for victims. The other issue is about working very, very closely with the police and opening ourselves up to scrutiny in a way that perhaps we haven't done so far. We've had our first rape scrutiny panel chaired by the Chief of London, Lionel Iden, and I know Claire and others were invited and they were there. It really opens up, shines a light on the work we're doing, and it gives us an opportunity for the community, those who represent the community, to challenge us about how we're working, what improvements they think we need to make, and we take that on board to strive to make improvements. So the key for us is about also looking at the way we prosecute cases and working with the Met again about an offender-centric approach, as we call it, looking closely at the suspect's actions before, during and after the offence. For example, has the victim been deliberately targeted because of their vulnerability, for example, maybe because of intoxication, and demonstrating this behaviour to jury can be crucial in proving the defendant did not reasonably believe that the complainant had consented. So these are some of the challenges we have. We are absolutely committed to ensure that where the Code for Crown Prosecutors, the test that we use to prosecute cases, is met, no matter how difficult or challenging a case is, we will aim to prosecute those cases. But there is quite a long way to go, and we're not going to turn it over, turn this around overnight. That's why it is a plan over a number of years.
Lovely, thank you. It does sound like there's a huge amount of work going on in so many different areas to try to turn this area around. But, you know, the elephant in the room is this huge court backlog that you're dealing with as well. What are you doing to support victims whose cases are held up in that process? And then I'm going to come to Claire and Sue about that as well.
Yeah, I think I did mention about what we're trying to do, and if you missed that, but I mentioned earlier in terms of actually supporting victims, we are trying to prioritise or try and triage. You know, that every case involving a victim, everybody wants to have their case at court, and inevitably, but we do have to try and work out the cases where people perhaps are more vulnerable. Their cases perhaps we need to prioritise, and some of the cases involving young witnesses, young children, we do work with the courts, HMCTS, to look at those cases, the listing. We write to judges, resident judges, asking if certain cases can be moved forward, be heard at certain courts, other facilities. Can we use Section 28, as I mentioned about the recordings? These are all the sort of systems that we have in place, but there is a massive backlog.
Yeah, but what about all the others? I heard that, and prioritising, but all the other victims, so what are you doing? Are you keeping in touch with them so they know what's happening? What do you do to support them? Because that's the information point that came up earlier. If you're informed, you know what's happening, then you're more likely to be satisfied with the process.
Absolutely. I mean, we have to work in partnership in terms of victim and witnesses care unit with the police. We do keep our police colleagues informed about their cases with witnesses, but we have to work in partnership. We don't actually have as much as we want to do that, so there's quite a few things that we want to do as part of obstetricia about more contact with victims directly, but that's in the rape world.
Yeah. Claire, do you want to comment on this and the support victims are getting whose cases are being held up in this huge backlog?
Yeah, it is a huge backlog, and as I said earlier, London is disproportionately impacted by the backlogs, and I think we are being overlooked as well. Something the Mayor and I have been calling for on government is we wanted a super court.
I think we had, as well, as the Chair mentioned.
So that would be great for your support, because we do need one in London. It went to Manchester and Loughborough instead, and we want to get these cases with the custody time limits, because they take priority and when they're handed cases into the big courts, and then we won't see such an impact. What I've seen with rape survivors is they're waiting 3-4 years, even longer, to get to court. And we had it just the other week, turns up on the morning of court, and it's a floater case and it's been pulled. I mean, the impact is hugely damaging, and that survivor wants to withdraw. Well, that's 4 years in the system. I mean, that's, really, really hard. What I would like to see, actually, is sexual violence courts in London, so that we can actually prioritise and make sure that doesn't happen to rape survivors. Something I'll be calling on in the Victims Bill, and make sure that we can push them into those dedicated courts, and we can safeguard their dates and that nothing happens to them, because, as I said, it's hugely traumatic. With regard to the point about information, we picked this up during the pandemic, and actually I got a huge amount of support from the Deputy Mayor, helped me convene a group with partners, with witness care units, Met and CPS, because we wanted to make sure that those that are just being held for so long in limbo waiting, that there was information going out to them. So we helped witness care unit write those letters, and the LVWS supported as well. And it was a great London partnership working to make sure those letters were going to victims so that they knew what was happening, because information is key, and also the offer of support was regularly being offered to them, because obviously the more time that goes on, trauma gets exacerbated and their needs become more complex.
Yeah. And Sue, from the Met's point of view.
Yeah, so it might be helpful, because witness care units come under the criminal justice portfolio that I have. So clearly we recognise that with the backlog that we were going to need additional support for victims. We increased our numbers to 218. We were able to get 12 additional staff in over the initial period of COVID to help us with some of the backlog, and we've just applied and have been accepted for MOJ funding for 20 more people to come into the witness care unit to help support staff. So the work of those witness care unit is to support people going through the process. We know that the timescales, because the backlogs, it will be some considerable time. But we work with them to identify any vulnerabilities, whether they're suitable for special measures, whether they're suitable for the Section 28 processes as intimidated or vulnerable witnesses. We ask the victims how they want to be kept in touch. Do they want a phone call every month? Do they want it more regularly? Do they want it on email, telephone? So we're guided by the victims on how they want us to be kept in touch. And we're part of the court recovery meetings with the CPS and HMCTS about, so that we understand what the problem is. We know it's not necessarily at Magistrates Court now, it's more at Crown Court, so it is the more serious crime, and that's where we've got our more vulnerable witnesses. So we have put more effort in, we have put more resources in to work more closely to support those victims.
Thank you. Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. Victims Commissioner, what are you doing to support victims of high volume crimes such as burglary and robbery?
So as I mentioned earlier, really working to raise awareness of the Victims Code of Practice, because it's really important that all victims, regardless of what crime type, accesses the right support and the right response. And in order for that to happen, it's really important we know when speaking to victims that they understand what their rights are. So when they come in, they know they should be referred to support. They know that they need a crime reference number. They know that they need to be responded to within X amount of time. So it's really the focus is on the Victims Code of Practice, because that will help all victims of crime. So that's why, as I said earlier, we're working on the victim leaflet, trying to get that better disseminated and making sure that there's raising awareness. We pick up things with the Met all the time, hearing from victims who come into police station to report. They weren't made aware of their rights, so worked with the Met to say, right, we need posters in police stations, make it more visible. And in fairness, they have responded and really tried to increase that awareness to victims so that they know, that they get the right response. And with regard to burglary, we talked about this very early on when I first became Victims Commissioner, that I didn't feel that the response was right for burglary victims. Often no one came back to them in any shape or form because they just said, well, there's nothing we can do, no investigation can take place. And often what victims want, especially burglary victims, is just to feel safe. They don't necessarily need that justice outcome, but they need someone to respond to what's happened to them and to make them feel safe. And that's something I work with the Met, so that they would give a right response. So an officer would then go and talk about, if it was in the home, what they could do in order to feel safe, and give them that human response, which is what every victim wants.
Absolutely. As we know, resources aren't the answer to everything. But with officer numbers now increasing, do you expect more volume crimes to a higher volume of crimes to be solved in the future, and therefore victims' satisfaction to go up? Maybe in 2 years' time, if we're having this conversation, might have a different picture.
So as I mentioned, it is about resourcing, because police are so overwhelmed. They have huge caseloads, very complex caseloads, and I do find that the response and support to victims often falls down the list. Again, that brings me to why I want to push forward for a victim care hub, so we can protect those rights and entitlements and make sure they're always delivered to every victim of crime. But yes, I hope that with more police officers we will see more victims being satisfied that their cases are being investigated and taken forward. But as I said, it's wider than that. It's not, yes, it's a police response, but it's also about what type of support service that victim is going to be referred to. It needs to be timely and effective support. Vulnerable victims, there are huge wait lists for counselling services, and that impacts the victim's satisfaction because it's stopping them from coping and recovering. So whilst we are always focused, obviously, on the police must give the right response, investigate for crimes, and keep victims updated, there's obviously wider areas as well that play a part in that victim satisfaction.
Thank you, Chair. I wonder, as a committee, we've heard a lot about advocacy, which is absolutely key. In a very vulnerable situation, a lot of the times people don't want to engage with officials but are prepared to speak with an advocate. You're aware of that. I'm aware of that through loads that we get. I wonder, and we've heard about the Victim Support Hub, I wonder if as a committee we could support that in some way, perhaps writing to government to ask if that's a possible thing that could be taken forward.
Yep, and certainly the mayor as well, because he's a large budget. Yep, absolutely. We'll take that by and look at it. Thank you. Assembly Member Garrett.
Good morning. A question for Chris, if I may, about the CPS. I understand your last published survey of witness and victim satisfaction with the CPS was published in 2015. And if that is the case, you know, how can we be confident that the service that you're providing, if there's so little recent information about, you know, how people have encountered it?
Thank you. I think there are plans for a further survey, but I don't actually have the details with me, so I do apologise for that. But I think in terms of victims and strategic sort of needs assessment, I think that's quite important. We mentioned earlier that the CPS has actually been looking about the way we communicate with victims. This is about the way we write to them and how we communicate with them. We've actually instructed a company to look at that. And we've been working with Havens, Redfred, Safer London and MOPAC and the London's Victims Commissioner, so grateful to them all. But we wanted to understand about the needs assessments and the communication. So we've got the research, and I think the next steps, we're reviewing them and we're going to be sharing the findings with all who are interested in that. And one thing also, we also look at is about the sort of committed to tackling race disparity, which I know is something MOPAC is looking at, and we've already delivered a number. We've accepted a number of the LAMI Review's recommendations into black and ethnic minority representation in the criminal justice system, and we're also aware that there's a lot of issues about disproportionality, and we are very keen, and we're working with MOPAC and police colleagues as well.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm conscious of time. I think the disproportionality question obviously is an important one, and I think we touched on that earlier. My question is specifically about, you know, we have those sort of what I might think of as operational or line of business conversations with people, so people who are in the system and you're speaking to them as they're going through it. I think the point about the survey is that, I suppose, afterwards or separately, those victims are being contacted and asked what they think. So I apologise if I missed the first part of your answer. Is 2015 the last time that you've been in touch to ask victims what they thought about the experience with the CPS?
I think that probably was the last date, as far as I can recollect.
And is there a plan, or perhaps you could write to us to let
us
know
about what can I have a look at that and come back to you?
I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot on an issue that you're not briefed on, because we want to have an accurate answer rather than a sort of, you know, so perhaps you could write to us about that. On a different topic, this is probably a question for the Met and for the Victim Commissioner. The London Rape Partnership and the Met co-location of the SOIT, the Sexual Offences Investigative Technique Officers, co-located with Haven colleagues, is that helping to reduce the attrition rate for rape and sexual violence cases? That we've spoken about the attrition rate already, but is that plan helping to reduce that?
So the aspiration would be to have them co-located, but at the moment, the service that we're offering victims through the SOIT has not changed. We have clinics where people can come and anonymously report rapes, and the SOIT officer will be there to support them. So the SOIT officer may not be based or co-located, but they are available at the Havens. And from a victim's point of view, they won't see anything different to the service that we're able to provide. It might not be ideally what everybody would like, but based on resourcing at the moment, we are able to offer the service, but not necessarily every Haven is there a co-located SOIT.
Want to comment on that as well, Claire, or is that have we got the?
No, I suppose all I have to add is, you know, for the last London Rape Review that I just published before Christmas, we saw a high proportion of rape victims withdrawing within the first month, 64%. And what that tells us is that we have to get rape survivors into support as quickly as possible. And we know that ISVAs, the role of the ISVA is absolutely critical. And so that's something I'm really working with MOPAC on. I want them to, and they've accepted the recommendation to look at how many ISVAs we have for London and how many more do we need in order to fulfil that ambition, which I know is also the ambition of the government. They also want to make sure every rape survivor has an ISVA, because then we'll keep them engaged. And I know that the role of the SOA officer will probably be looked at as the findings of Operation Satira come out over the next few weeks as well.
It's interesting to hear that that first period, as so often in so many things, turns out to be the most important. Thank you very much for your answer. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We're now moving on to supporting victims and witnesses, and that first questions are taken by my colleague, Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, just put this in the right place. So my first question is for John Poyton from Red Thread, and also I'll be coming to Rachel Nicholas from the victim support point of view as well. But John, to start off with, are you content that what is set out in the police and crime plan for victims is sufficient and that it'll improve victim satisfaction?
I think that Claire's point around the young people particularly needing an independent support to take them through is really key. Red Thread's young women's workers provide that in just a handful of, less than a handful of hospitals across London, but we see that provides real support independently in enabling young people to engage in a trauma-informed way. I really welcome the victims' hubs as a way of ensuring that less young people fall through the gaps.
Thank you, and I'll be picking up on the Victims Hub a bit later in my questioning. So, Rachel, do you want to add anything?
I would just add that within the London Victim and Witness Service, we have two main independent roles. One is a victims advocate, an independent victims advocate, and the other is the independent domestic violence advocate that most people are familiar with. And I think it's vitally important that all victims, regardless of age, gender, sexuality, etc., have access to independent advocates that are independent of the other systems within the criminal justice system, in order to be able to hold those other systems to account, and to be able to make sure that the victim's voice is actually heard and that the victim gets the answers that they need when they need them, to be able to progress their cases through. So I do welcome the idea of a victims hub, but it really does need to have that level of independence. And I would very much like to see that going forward. I think there are certain elements where we are seeing that the commitment seems to be there within the plan, but not necessarily the resource behind it to be able to cope with the increasing demands that we have seen over the past 2 years, and also the increasing demands on our services in relation to the complexity of needs that people are showing up with, particularly in relation to mental health. I think the Mayor needs to be thinking and also working really closely with public health and public health colleagues in order to actually really tackle the issues of crime in the capital, because it's integrated. It's, you know, we need to be having this full approach to doing this, I think, in order to make a difference.
Actually, just yesterday in Oversight Committee, we were agreeing a sort of a new public health function which cuts across policing, transport, as well as the sort of more traditional health side of public health. So it seems that within the GLA there is definitely that thinking of pulling that public health function sort of right up and central. Thank you. To the Victims Commissioner, I've just got one very specific thing about a specific group of victims that I just wanted to raise, and this is victims of road traffic collisions. In the plan, there's a clear will to enhance specialist support for bereaved families and seriously injured victims in road traffic collisions in London, and that's great. But there's a whole extra group of people who are seriously injured on the roads in London, and they are not necessarily getting the support that they need. I'm not going to take up a lot of committee time, but I will write to you with some suggestions on this, because it is shocking how many people are in this situation, and if they don't pass that, if it's not a collision where someone has died or had a life-changing injury, then it's not picked up, with sort of forensic examination. And but I think there's a category of people, of Londoners, who really do need a bit more support as victims in that place. So my next question is also for the Victims Commissioner. Has the Victims Strategic Needs Assessment been completed? I think it was due at the end of 2021. And if so, what do the findings show?
Yeah, that's the MOPAC Strategic Needs Assessment.
Yes.
Yes. So it has been completed. I think there was a report, and I don't remember the date of when it was published, maybe in the summer. So you would need to go to MOPAC to get that. I've looked at it and I've identified where there are some gaps that I would like to do further work, and that's around victims of child sexual abuse and sexual exploitation. That's come up as a bit of a gap of an area that I would like to take forward with the right resource. And it's very interesting what it's shown us, pretty much what what my work shows me as well, but I think it's been very useful for MOPAC to look at that, to help influence the services they commission and where the gaps are as well. But again, that's something, because I'm independent from MOPAC, you would need to get from MOPAC what I can help you get.
Okay, thank you. Then the thing that keeps coming up today is the Victim Care Hub. Yeah. Now, you said earlier that you don't think it's sort of believable that the police are going to be able to give victims the support that they need. This is just relating to this whole issue of trust and confidence, which is so much in all our minds after that, frankly, just disgusting report that came out yesterday. Yes, can you give us a sort of full update on when the Victim Care Hub is actually going to be operational?
I mean, that's out of my control, because ultimately, as I said earlier, it needs some changes in legislation in order to achieve what I would like as an independent victim care hub. Because at the moment, there's a statutory duty on the police to deliver certain rights and entitlements to victims. And I would like to see that being taken over by an independent victim care hub, who I believe would be able to do a better job at delivering those rights and entitlements. That's something I've raised directly with the government, with the Ministry of Justice, through the Victims Bill consultation. We've actually been discussing with the government directly where the changes might need to be made in legislation in order to enable something independent. So in answer to your question, I mean, the time frame I couldn't give, because there needs to be some fundamental changes in order to enable something that would be a complete transformation in the way that victims receive support through the criminal justice system.
I wonder, Chair, is that something that the committee could give its support to, as Assembly Member Ahmed also raised earlier?
Yeah, I think it's something we need to discuss and see what we can do about that, or certainly write to relevant people.
Thank you.
Just clarification, you said the strategic needs assessment has been completed. Did you say it had been published?
As I say, we'd need to check with MOPAC. I've seen the final report, and I would need to check if it's actually been published or not, because it was a MOPAC strategic needs assessment that they did.
Okay,
So we need to clarify that.
Okay, fine, thank you. Assembly Member Moema.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is, is to Rachel and to John and Chris, and we'll come to you, so all of you, and that is around whether or not you feel that MOPAC services are reaching the most vulnerable victims, and what more can.
Sorry, Sam, can you either talk nearer, or this one might have gone as well? No, I don't think it is. There we go. Thank you. Okay. Thanks. Sorry about that.
It's okay. Can you hear me now? Okay, perfect. I'll start again.
Yeah, that's better. Thanks.
So my question was around whether or not you feel that MOPAC services are reaching the most vulnerable victims, and what more can be done to perhaps target those or make sure that those that need the support need it, receive it. And I guess also what you think is standing in the way of that service delivery. So perhaps if I start with you, Rachel, or.
Yes, thank you. So to kind of answer that question is just with and open it with a caveat really, is that there is always more that can be done. But thinking about some of the work that we're doing in trying to reach those victims that aren't necessarily the ones that use social media or websites, etc. And I think it's about taking services to where victims generally go to. So I mean, we like Red Thread actually, we are based in 16 of London hospitals, so that we're within their A&E and maternity services, so that we're able to, and through that method we are engaging with different types of victims that don't necessarily report to the police at all, or may not have reported to the police yet. And I think that's where I think services, independent services, and particularly smaller by and for organisations, are very useful in being the kind of the voice and the focal point for victims who are more marginalised across our capital. I think working. I think that the Mayor's Office and MOPAC fund a number of different services across London, and have spent a lot of time actually really looking at how they can reach some of those more smaller by and for organisations, and a lot of work has been done in this area. There is always still more to be done. I can't think of there was another point, but it's gone. So
fine. She'll come back to you.
Rachel's already picked up on a number of points there, and the hospitals, I feel, are MOPAC has been supporting outside of the criminal justice system this sort of work in engaging victims, particularly for Red Thread, young people, in this teachable moment when they come to an anchor institution in their community, a hospital outside of the criminal justice system. I think that is really crucial. From the youth violence and the young women's, the VORG approach, MOPAC is currently funding, I think, possibly half of the A&E departments across, and it'd be good for Rachel and I outside of this to work out, actually map all of the hospitals across London, because I think, to your question, I suppose, the young people are certainly vulnerable. I think it's often not the young people that are hard to reach, but often the systems and the services that are set up that are hard to reach for those young people or those victims. And I think that is where there needs to be more joining up of those services to ensure that victims don't feel like they are either falling through the gap or being passed from pillar to post, which again takes us to the best idea of the Victims Hub, but Rachel had some very good points earlier about how to make sure that is really doing what it needs to do. I thought the earlier point about the public health approach is a really important way to ensure, and it is certainly something that I know that the Mayor and MOPAC have been very supportive of, but is a really great framework in which to ensure we bring all partners to the table, both voluntary sector from those of us in that sector, but also the statutory services across criminal justice, policing and health. I think undoubtedly that commitment to a public health approach across London and across the country has lost some momentum in the last couple of years for understandable reasons, perhaps. I feel that now 2022 is a really crucial year for us to build that momentum again around a public health approach that I think all sectors have bought into and will bring everyone together outside perhaps particularly the perverse incentive, I suppose, that commissioning can create a competition between voluntary sector organisations where young people again fall through the gaps because we're all trying to report, on the work that we're doing. So I think the MOPAC makes great strides in supporting young, particularly from our point of view, young victims of violence outside of the criminal justice system and joining that together. I think that undoubtedly there are always steps to take that forward outside of MOPAC's own commissioning. I'm really interested in health commissioning to come alongside and to match that, and not just to look at it although obviously for this committee it is focusing on policing, but I think that there's lots to bring together.
Thank you. And so if I come to you, Chris, but in your consideration, Claire and Commander Williams, it would be really helpful to think about those crimes in addition to those that are violent crimes. We had a session a few weeks ago with Safer Neighbourhood Boards and the issues that people face, that although they are thankfully not victims of a violent crime, they are victims of a crime which has had serious mental health impacts on them, and they, like others, are traumatised, albeit not physically. So.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can I just say that in relation to the CPS interaction with MOPAC, that's at the partnership level, but our actual daily interaction is with the Police Witness Care Unit and the London Victims and Witnesses Services. One thing that we are taking forward in London jointly with the Met is about special measures which supports vulnerable victims to give their best evidence, or the quality of evidence. So we've got a pilot running in London where a relevant sort of form is completed, which sets out the special measures as to why the victims want them and why what needs addresses, and that's been redrafted to make it more easier to support the witnesses, but also so CPS can put forward better applications to the court to support the victims and witnesses to give their best evidence. There's regular meetings with the Mets and the CPS about that, evaluating how that pilot's working, and we're hopeful, not just from a London perspective, but nationally, that's something that can be rolled out. Our victim and witness lead, who's the policy lead on this, is also going to be presenting to the witness care units and the police case management team leads about the role of intermediaries as well, and the vital role that they play. I mean, there's obviously a shortage of them, but it's obviously recognising when we do need to apply to use intermediaries that we're making it in good time, so we don't put trials off or cause further delays.
So I think it's would be useful for you to know that whilst MOPAC commission quite a lot of services across London, and we've heard about that today, and also we've got the ISVAs and the IDVAs for rape and domestic abuse support for victims. Every single borough will have their health and wellbeing boards, and they'll have children safeguarding and adult safeguarding boards where the statutory partners sit, and they commission quite a lot of victim support locally. So depending on their priorities, they may have, it might be culturally, they might have for specific communities, they might have domestic abuse for whatever the community is on their particular borough, or if they've got issues in terms of violent crime with young people, they might commission support from the voluntary sector or other charitable groups or outreach groups to be able to support those victims. So I think if you mapped it out across London and the work that the statutory partners are involved in, yes, MOPAC have huge amount of services and support, but there's complemented by what is commissioned locally through the BCUs and the boroughs. And this is where you get your, the healthcare system. And we know at the moment they've been under huge strain, but that healthcare and the commissioning through the health and wellbeing boards does plug some of the gaps for what you might think like the more chaotic mental health, drugs, alcohol, all sorts of other support that might be required locally for the victims. And we, well, our SPOCs will be aware of that, so that the officers, if they know that these victim supports are available, they can then signpost them in. It's normally done through public protection teams, because they will know what's available throughout their borough and BCU, and that complements some of the work you've heard of.
I think just to add to that, it has been a real focus, I know with MOPAC, on really trying to ensure that there are services for underrepresented communities, and there's been investment in grassroots community services and a real focus on that. And especially when the London Victim Witness Service was commissioned, there had to be access to specialist support services, as Rachel's mentioned, the Sister Space and other support services for those who may not come forward or want to come forward to a generic service like victim support and need something far more specialist. So it is a real focus. I've done a lot of engagement with those from underrepresented communities, because my concern is that they aren't coming forward to the services and we are not reaching them. And what comes out loud and clear often is, firstly, a lot of victims in underrepresented communities don't always recognise that what's happening to them is abuse. And so there's some real work to be done there, first of all, for them to understand this is not acceptable, from like coercive control, domestic abuse. And there's also a shame, a cultural shame, and coming forward, they don't want to see an impact on their culture, so they'll stay silent. So there's a lot of things that we need to work through. One of the ideas, and I think the Mayor may well look at this more in his police and crime plan, is around, as Rachel's saying, the work in communities, community spaces, but safe spaces as well. Safe spaces for people to go to within the community. They may not want to disclose about abuse, but they can find out what's available in their area that will hopefully draw them out and make them come forward and feel that they have that trust, really, to come forward to somebody and disclose. And on John's point, it's absolutely critical to have that public health approach, because many will first disclose to their GP, it'll come up in health settings, and we need to make sure that we get the right response back to them.
Thank you. My next question is slightly more focused on issues to do with stalking and harassment. And so there is a debate in Parliament happening which calls for better funding and resources to deal with stalking after a petition from the family of Gracie Spinks. And you will also know the really tragic circumstances of Jasmine Treiki's murder recently. She did have a protection order in place, and she had said to the police repeatedly that she thinks that her ex-husband will kill her, and he did in broad daylight. And I think of particular issues in my constituency which are particularly egregious and long-standing. And it's around what happens to somebody before something violent happens. So those victims of stalking, harassment, how they, if you like, enter the system and are believed, and that what they are facing is dealt with as a criminal offence, or potentially criminal before something very tragic and final, as in the case of Gracie and Jasmine. So my question is around whether or not you feel there needs to be more ring-fenced funding to tackle this particular issue, and whether you're confident that there is a consistent offer to victims across all of London at the moment.
So as you're probably aware, stalking is a particular area of my expertise. I worked on the stalking legislation when it first came in. I also helped to set up with the Met their Stalking Threat Assessment Centre. And the idea of STAC is to bring together partners, because when you deal with stalking, you need a partnership response. So it's the police with the CPS, but also with health partners as well, and probation, because it's about ensuring that they identify those patterns of behaviour before it escalates into further harm and murder, which we do see unfortunately, in stalking cases, especially if it's with an ex-partner. And so it's really important that the good work, and there's great practice within STAC, but that has to be disseminated out into the Met. And that's something that I've been picking up with the Met directly, that if we have a stalking victim, we can refer them into STAC, we know that it'll be picked up properly and the case will be dealt with properly. I'm not confident that if a stalking victim called the police and went to report, that it would always be picked up as a stalking case. Often it's downgraded to harassment and the risk assessments aren't being done properly. So another piece of work that I really want to do next is around a deep dive into stalking, to see how the Met is actually responding to stalking, where those issues are, and to drive real change. Because for me, it's a huge frustration to have worked so hard on the legislation and to not see it being embedded in the way that it should, and to see all these tragic cases where the red flags would have been there. There was a stalking protection order in place. We need to see what's happened with that and why, if there were breaches, why it wasn't taken forward and why the proper protection wasn't put in place. With regard to support, the MOPAC actually fund a specific service in London for stalking victims through the Susie Lamplugh Trust, who run the National Stalking Helpline. It's an excellent service. I think the critical issue is around stalking victims getting the right police response and getting referred into that specialist support service.
Williams?
Yes, so, the Stalking Threat Assessment Centre is really a fantastic team of officers that review all allegations of stalking and support local officers in their investigation. I think sometimes the bit that's missing is if the officers haven't identified it is a stalking and it might just be shown as harassment, it may not always be picked up. So what we've got is these liaison officers in every single borough within the public protection teams who look at stalking, but who also work and can consult with that Stalking Threat Assessment Centre where the experts are, so that they can get that support for the victim. We, in light of what happened last week, we are reviewing every single stalking harassment breach and also stalking offenders. So we are doing a piece of work on that, just to make sure that if there are violent people, that we can put them into tasking to have them arrested as soon as possible. So there is some proactivity going on alongside that, but we recognise the vulnerability around stalking and harassment. So there is more we can do. There's no doubt about that. Working on the learning from the STAC about working with other agencies in healthcare and probation is a unique thing, but we need to make sure every single BCU can mirror that locally and has the support to support victims.
Just quickly on that point. So if I'm understanding you, there is one officer per borough, which is positive. But if the decision is made to look at violent stalking rather than, I think my point is those situations where it hasn't yet become violent, that feels like it's not resourced, and perhaps that's where there is that downgrade to harassment and taking that threat of violence from that person. I appreciate not everybody will become violent, but it is traumatic nonetheless for those women in particular who are living with that, wherever they go.
It's a really difficult situation when you're presented with an allegation of maybe harassment that might be considered a low-level type of crime like common assault, but there's a potential there, and at what point do you wrap around the services around the victim and arrest the suspect? And we know that from domestic abuse, that it can be standard risk type reports that come into police, and then they, where you might not be putting all your proactivity on an individual, and then they go and do something really violent. So how do you identify very early on? And this is the risk assessments that we work in. So this is where we've been looking at the DA Matters training, because within there they cover the domestic abuse risk assessment, the Thrive, which is Thrive Plus, which is new threat and harm risk assessment. And they've been working to identify coercion control, because a lot of our stalking harassment is ex-partners anyway, so it would be domestic abuse. So we're trying to get that information to the officers of what the nuances of just because someone reports a harassment, it could elevate, and you've got to look at the risk behind that. So there could be an awful lot of risk in there in the risk assessment that will come out that isn't necessarily obvious when the person first reports that allegation. You know, it's difficult prioritising, you know, when you've got 14,000 outstanding offenders. Where do you prioritise in terms of the violence or the potential violence? It has to be, you have to prioritise somewhere, because we don't have resources to arrest every single person as much as we want to. So we do prioritise, but I think you're right. There are some crimes where they might on the surface look at a lowish level, and the violence hasn't yet materialised, but you have to be alive to it, and that's what our training has all been about.
Sorry, yeah, but I can just add to that. So I'm really pleased to hear the Commander say that there are now SPOCs for stalking in each BCU, because there hasn't been, and that's something I've been calling on. For an organisation as large as Met, they do need a SPOC for stalking in each BCU to help disseminate the good practice from the Stalking Threat Assessment Centre. I think what the issues are, and it also brings, you know, with CPS partners, is there is often a response by police to class something as harassment, and the CPS will follow that line sometimes as well, when actually the stalking legislation should have been used for the cases. So that's where we really need to keep sharp focus on, to make sure that these stalking cases, because stalking, there often isn't violence in stalking, but it's a pattern of behaviour that is showing there's a risk there, and it has a huge detrimental impact to the victim and their lives. So I just want to put it out that there is a lot of work to pick up with the Met and the CPS to make sure we are recognising stalking cases and not putting them down as harassment.
There we go. My next question again is to the Met and the Victims Commissioner and the CPS, and that is just really briefly, obviously we have the report yesterday in our minds, and I just wonder what you're doing or how you're working with Black and minority ethnic victims in particular to access help and support. I mean, we've seen that numbers are improving, but within the cohort of what MOPAC looks at in terms of satisfaction, that number for Black and minority ethnic Londoners is kind of stubbornly low. I just wonder what you're doing to change that.
Sorry, if I go first. So we do have victim forums which are represented of the different communities across London in terms of diversity, whether it's BAME heritage diversity or whether it's LGBT or disability. And David and his team have got, I think, about 21 different representatives that sit on there. We've also got domestic abuse victim voice groups and different representatives that sit on our RASO groups as well, sexual violence, so that the lead responsible officers, including lead responsible officers in hate crime as well. So all the lead responsible officers for the different crime types will have a way of being able to connect through to different communities. The point I made in a question earlier on was that the boroughs and the BCUs will also be looking at the gaps in satisfaction between different communities as well. So they should be working on community engagement directly with the communities, getting into some of those diverse communities and the hidden communities and the hard to reach communities to explain what their services are and how they can support victims of crime, and getting people to come forward and tell us what's happened so that we can offer the support that's available out there. So I know that goes on locally on the BCUs, as well as at more strategic level with our lead responsible officers and the victim care forums. And I know David can fill you in if you wanted a little bit more detail, if you want to go to Claire.
Yep.
So as I said earlier, I've done a lot of engagement with victims from underrepresented communities, especially for the Mayor's refresh of his new VORG strategy, which we publish soon, because I was hearing from Black victims, and in particular Black female victims, just how difficult it was to access justice and support, and really wanted to identify what those barriers were. So having listened to them, and we run a number of focus groups, there are, some critical issues. Firstly, we still have the ongoing issue that both the Mayor and I raised well over 3 years ago, and I know that helped to set up the Step Up Migrant campaign. But for many migrant survivors from these underrepresented communities, they won't come forward to report to the police for fear that their immigration status will be prioritised over their victimisation. We haven't solved that problem, so for those migrant survivors, there is no trust and confidence for them to come forward to the police. We've worked really hard lobbying the government to try and bring in a firewall. We have to look at how we make reporting safe and secure from those from underrepresented communities that might have insecure immigration status. If we don't, there's a massive cohort of victims that we continue to fail who will not get justice and will not get the support that they need and will stay trapped in very abusive and violent relationships and continue with the victimisation. Cultural competency came up a lot around intersectionality training with the police and for them to understand different cultures and their backgrounds, why some survivors were reluctant to come forward and want to stay engaged and what support they really needed, specialist support to help them stay through that process. That's why it's so important to have buy-in for specialist support by organisations who understand the communities and work with those communities. As I said earlier, one of the critical issues that I've picked up is many from underrepresented communities not recognising necessarily that what's happening to them is abuse. And we really do need to look at some victim-focused campaign to raise awareness of different forms of abuse and what that looks like so that victims can relate and understand that that's happening to them, and then provide safe and secure spaces within the community that they feel comfortable coming forward to. Because, we have to talk about the elephant in the room. The trust and confidence is gone with the police. Yesterday's IOPC report was nothing short of sickening, and that will impact trust and confidence. So, I know how hard some of the team in the Met are working to address that, but we need to make sure that the communities feel able and that they feel confident to come forward, and I don't think that's the case at the moment.
Yeah, no, absolutely, completely agree. It's fair to say that it's blown a lot of trust out the water in communities that didn't really have it to start with. But if I could come to you, Chris, that'd be really helpful.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, in terms of disproportionality in supporting victims of a BAME background, CPS and the NPCC published a joint statement on hate crime, covering the core principles and shared approaches about how we tackle this. We also have a multiple community accountability forums, which is chaired by our Chief Executive Officer and the co-founder of Tell Mama and the director of Faith Matters as well. So we've also looked at the impact of COVID on the CJS, criminal justice system, for different ethnic minority groups, including hate crime towards those from a BAME background, including from Asians, Africans, and African Caribbean backgrounds, and the Jewish community. We've also held meetings with stakeholders to discuss their experiences in the criminal justice system, both as victims and defendants. So that's one of the other approach. The other approach that we've done a lot of work on also is in relation to hate crime. As you would all know, rather sadly, during the England footballers who were targeted, and the escalation of the hate crimes as a result of that. So again, work have been dealt with in that sphere as well. We've instituted training programs again about hate crime, about how we approach it and how we expect our prosecutors to do that. There's a lot of community work that we're doing. We talked about community engagement.
If I could just quickly interrupt you. So within that, I'm quite intrigued to understand, obviously hate crime covers a lot. There's been, as you say, a growth in anti-Semitic hate crime, LGBT hate crime, and so on. But one of the underlying, if you like, constants is that anti-black racism and hatred towards black Londoners is consistently the highest, highest form of hate crime in London. And what is there happening proactively to reverse that, alongside all of the other issues that have seen a spike?
Yeah, I think the issue that was touched upon earlier is also about sometimes underreported. And we work closely with the police. We're demand-led, so if cases are sent to us, we'll prosecute them if our code of test is met. That said, it's easier said than done because sometimes victims and witnesses do not come forward because actually they don't want, as the commanders mentioned earlier, necessarily a criminal justice outcome. They just want it to stop. And so some of the work we're doing is actually reaching out to communities. I've spoken, for example, to the Chinese community. We have reached out to BAME black groups as well to talk about the impact crime has on them and why don't they report crimes. We've met with the travelling community, for example, to talk about domestic abuse. And again, very, very difficult subjects because people don't want to necessarily raise these issues because they're quite concerned that the people they're actually speaking to might actually be perpetrators of offences. So it's trying to widen our reach and to have these face-to-face conversations, allowing people to understand what the role of the CPS is, that we're independent of the police. We do work in partnership, but we are wholly independent. And about how we apply our code and how we make our decisions, applying our policies, for example, in hate crime. So for the last 4 years, I've spent a considerable time meeting with various sector groups, various charitable groups. We chair a local scrutiny impact panel, again asking for representation from all groups to come and talk to us to explain about how we can make a difference in the way we prosecute cases and challenging our approaches. So they don't just look at policies, but they talk about the cases where things haven't gone well and cases where there have been successes. What happened? Do we publicise that? There's a considerable amount of work to be done there.
Sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but I can feel the chair looking at me, so
yeah.
That's okay. We'll move on. Is that final
Sorry?
question? Do my final question? And
Yes, if I could ask guests to keep their answers to a minimum, please.
Yes,
We're
of
running
course.
very
Sorry
over
about
time.
that.
And we are regurgitating some of these. It's really, really interesting, and I can understand why. But if you could keep them shorter, I'd be grateful.
Thank you, Chair. So my final question is to Rachel and John, and that is around what specific needs do you think the victims that you support have, in addition to what you have said, ideally, in the interest of time, and what could we do to improve services to them?
One of the things that I was just thinking about whilst this conversation about race, and particularly in relation to black men and women, I think we have to recognise that our criminal justice system has got a disproportionate amount of black males in prison, and that will be a fundamental reason as to why black women do not report domestic abuse. We have a whole issue in society that is larger than the criminal justice system, but is absolutely pinnacled in the criminal justice system that I think we need to address in order to be able to address the larger issues around trust and confidence. How we do that, I'm afraid I don't have the magic wand. I wish I did, but it's something that we can only do as together. And I hope to see them myself as an ally, but it's very difficult to be an ally, a real true ally, and so therefore actually making sure that I'm as educated as possible and working with organisations such as Sister Space, who are a much better place to make these arguments than I am. But it's really important that we include the communities that we are serving within the services that we are providing in order to make sure that we actually do the best job that we can.
I think joining up some of the answers that have been given previously, I think some of the specific needs that the victims that we're working with have, I think we've talked around, particularly in relation to the sort of literacy and a physical or an online leaflet and communications. I think it's really important to recognise that an awful lot of young people or victims will have neurodiversity. And we need to look at particularly young people caught up in the criminal justice system. We know that disproportionately they are likely to have not perhaps performed well in mainstream education and to have neurodiversity like ADHD and dyslexia. So we need to really explore how we share that support and how we communicate that and how we build up the trust that is needed for them to reach out and ask for that help. I think that one of the real needs that a lot of victims have is to be seen as a victim. If we're talking about young men, again, particularly, they are often known to other parts of the system, the criminal justice system, and they may be seen as perpetrators. And so we need to be able to be aware of perhaps that victim-perpetrator cycle, but recognise that it is when the young person is, they may not want to be labelled as a victim, and similarly not wanting to be labelled as an offender, but we need to be able to look at that wide array of support. And in that, I think it's really important that, again, we find access points for any victims to reach out and ask for that help across the community. And so we've talked about safe spaces, we've talked about the health system being a great ally to the criminal justice system in working separately but in parallel, and it's about raising the profile of the victims across the system, across the professional network. And I think that's where victim support and Red Thread spend a lot of our time in supporting and educating and training our, in the hospital setting, doctors and nurses and allied health professionals. And I think that there is some great work going on with partner organisations like IRIS-I, Safe Lives and others who are looking at training up those that are working with victims so that we, as a society, everyone takes it as their responsibility to identify and be able to signpost victims. I think that's where there's been great work under that umbrella of a public health approach over the last few years in Scotland and other places where hairdressers are supported and trained to signpost for victims of domestic violence, or vets where people bring their animals and recognise that these are some of those teachable moments where we need to be able to train up not just police, not just doctors and nurses, not just the voluntary sector support caseworkers, but also sort of members of society as well.
Okay, I'm going to leave anybody else that wants a question to the very end if we have it, and we'll go on to the last section now. And if we could keep this as tight as we can, please, colleagues, starting with Assembly Member Garrett.
So the section actually, Chair didn't say, is about violence against women and girls, and I think some of the issues that would fall under this we've touched on already, because obviously it's such a big area of victims not needing support. So I've got a sort of broad question to start off, but I'm conscious that A, of time, and B, that some of this has been covered already. So perhaps you can maybe focus perhaps on parts that you haven't already mentioned. So if we start with the Victim Commissioner, and then I'll ask victim support as well in a moment. Are victims of, so women and girls who are victims of violence, sorry, I hate the term VOG, I think it's a horrible word. Anyway, so women and girls who are victims of violence, are they getting the support that they need?
Well, as we've talked about quite a lot this morning, support covers lots of different areas. So I would say from a MOPAC perspective and what they commission in services, there's been a record investment in services to help women and girls impacted by violence. But I think, of course, way more needs to be done, and the type of support they get if they come forward. We've already talked about the support from police and CPS and through the criminal justice system as well, because for the very few that might make it to court, the court isn't a very good experience either. As I said, I think the justice system is deeply entrenched with rape myths and stereotypes, which create a huge barrier to many victims getting the support and the justice that they need. So that's a wider cultural issue that I think the entire justice system needs to address. But as John and I think Rachel have talked about, there is support that's needed from the community. So grassroots organisations are absolutely critical. And I know that MOPAC fund a number of grassroots organisations. But as John says, there's a lot of other places within society where women and girls need support, from the workplace to the places that they go to, people understanding and recognising it, and to have allies as well. We've talked a lot, and everyone here is very aware of the societal issues in relation to abuse of women and girls, and what we all need to do in order to call it out and stamp it out and give that support to survivors. So, yeah, there's, as I say, if we're looking at MOPAC, yes, I think there's a good level of support, But if we're looking at the wider justice system and societal response as well, much more needs to be done.
Thank you. So, and did you want to add as well from victim support's point of view?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think what we're seeing at the moment is each quarter there is an increase in domestic abuse and sexual violence. People who are coming forward are asking for support. And at some point we need to ask ourselves actually how we keep up with the momentum of that. And I think, yes, there are some really good support services out there, but we've been through a really tough couple of years, and that's taken its toll on every single person in this room and outside of this room. And we just keep asking more of people. And I think what we find in the voluntary sector particularly is that the workers tend to always give more than is asked of them. And we can't keep asking that of people, because at some point that well will run dry. I think that's the biggest challenge that we're really facing. Well, it's one of the big challenges. The biggest challenge is misogyny when we're coming to, and the society that we live in that actually still places women as second-class citizens. But yes, so there are some brilliant support services out there, but there is still lots more to be done, and we need to recognise that we are on an upward trajectory in terms of the need of people coming forward.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we'd echo those thoughts. If I could ask Chris from the CPS, again, I think you may have covered some of this already, but what are the specific support that you give to those victims, particularly women and girls who've suffered, whether it's rape or some other kind of violent crime? What are the support that you give to them as they're going through that process?
Thank you. You're right. I have covered that, so I'll be extremely brief. I think I mentioned earlier that it's about special measures. That's one of the key things that support that we provide to victims of violence against women or girls, but also it's about identifying their needs early on. We talked about intermediaries, and I mentioned about Section 28, about the evidence being recorded and the cross-examination. These are things that obviously going forward will make a real difference when it's rolled out across the whole of London.
Thank you. And I had a couple of questions about the report that came out yesterday, and that's not the IOPC report that we've already spoken about, but the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse by Alexis J, co-authored by Alexis J, into child sexual exploitation by organised networks. And it was only published yesterday. I haven't read the whole thing, but aware of this discussion we'll be having today, I did read the section on recognising the child as the victim. And I have to say, I read that section of the report with mounting horror. So if I may, conscious of the fact that the report is new, I think the issues are not new. So if I could ask you, Commander Williams, one of the issues that comes up in here, there's a whole subsection about blaming child victims. And I think we've been aware in the past of child victims being characterised as a sort of lifestyle choice, as child prostitution. And we're talking about, 12, 13-year-old girls having relationships with adult men. It feels like what the report is saying is that we've moved on, but we're still describing, I use the royal we, describing those girls as, in some sense, actively engaging in this kind of behaviour and not seeing, a 13-year-old girl with an adult man as a victim, even though she may herself feel that she's in a consenting relationship. So if I could ask a question about use of language and the sort of victim-blaming language, Commander Williams, is that something that, can we consign that to history?
So the report you're talking on, the case studies were based in 2017-18, so quite some time ago. And we've been working on that
sorry to interrupt. I don't like to interrupt. This has been going on for decades, and one of the things that report says is that we have to not see it as a historic thing. Right. Sorry, if you may continue.
So I'm just putting it into the context, okay. But in terms of victim blaming, we clearly, we have been picked up on that in the past by the HMIC when they've done their inspections. So we've learned from that, these are young people who are victims of crime, who have been exploited, whether it's sexually, whether it's criminally, and we cannot blame the victims. So we've changed the way that we deal with that. We have, within our public protection units, there are child protection, but there's also, they deal with child sexual exploitation and child criminal exploitation. And we have a central team that deal with it. And we also have online child support, child sexual online abuse teams in every single BCU. So we recognise that the language that we've used in the past where we said a child is at risk, well, they've already been harmed. So they're at harm, and there's things that we have to do with them to protect them as soon as we know about those allegations. So we have changed, we have done a lot of work in terms of the training of our officers and how they deal with young victims of these types of abuse. There are issues that came up around consent, that a child can't give consent. But of course, if you're talking of a 16, 17-year-old, really difficult when they say they've given consent to a 19-year-old. So, there are, we're not talking like 12, 13. There were some issues there where, consent can be applied in certain situations. But what we've been really keen on is making sure officers understand that child sexual abuse, that the child is at harm, and treat the child as a victim right at the off as soon as you get that information, so that we can support the victim going forward. And what is really, really important is listening to that child victim. So a lot of the allegations come through third parties or come through the social services, children's social services. But what's important to us is actually speaking to the victim, getting to them, speaking to them, listening to them, and not attaching blame to them for the position they're in. So I know what the report says, but I do think that we have changed the way that we look at victims of child sexual abuse and exploitation, and we are more supportive of the victim and their journey through what can be a very difficult criminal justice process at that age.
Yeah, actually, this is going to be the third thing I was going to ask about, but you sort of touched on it, because in the final subsection there, actually, you're quoted about, this is about ensuring the child's voice is heard, and the issue of officers not listening to children, which means, first of all, disclosures get missed, and second of all, intelligence is lost about what's going on. And I think you're quoted in the report as saying that it's a work in progress. So is what you're telling us today, that a lot of progress has been made on that? Because you mentioned sort of the issues, for example, of lots of new officers coming in who aren't aware of, maybe they bring in attitudes that is not what we'd want. So can we take it then that the work in progress you talk about in the report, that is really happening? In terms of listening to children in particular?
Yes, so there was already work that was ongoing when the inquiry happened, and evidence was given last year, because in Tower Hamlets, it is a thematic inspection, there were 5 forces, but Tower Hamlets was selected from the Met, and Tower Hamlets had a very innovative exploitation team embedded in the local authority right up until, unfortunately, COVID, but they were working very closely, and even though they might not have been co-located in the last, during COVID, they were working together every morning on Teams or the systems to be able to ensure that that they protected the victims. So I think that work was already ongoing, and we've learned from some of the good practice from Tower Hamlets, and we've made sure that that best practice has been pushed around the organisation, so that other public protection teams who deal with exploitation can pick up the work from Tower Hamlets, the work of the exploitation teams, but also, and we know there have been recommendations, as I said, from HMIC, but how we deal with victims and not using victim blaming language, really, really important, but listening to the voice of the victim, paramount.
Well, the other thing that I wanted to mention, which was going to be the second thing, but is now the final thing, was the bit that I have to say got me really quite angry when I read this. We've spoken quite a lot about sanctioning today, sanction detection rates, and how perpetrators very often get away with their crime. The bit that I found very difficult reading, subsection E2, sanctioning child victims. So this is where a child has been a victim and they themselves are sanctioned for a crime, and in some cases the actual perpetrator of the abuse they're suffering is not sanctioned. I'm not sure whether I want to. There are two case studies in here, for example. A girl who fought. So she describes how she'd suffered bust lips, bust nose, black eye, fingerprint marks around her arms and throat. She fought off that man with a bread knife and then found herself with a criminal conviction for having done so. And there's a girl with the pseudonym Daisy, well known to police by the time she was 13 years old. She was arrested and charged on a number of occasions, offences such as being drunk and disorderly or assault. She described these as being committed in the context of the abuse that she was experiencing, which we know there's a lot of drug and alcohol abuse that those victims are suffering. She appeared in a youth offenders court aged 15. Her solicitor tried to explain the abuse that she was suffering, but no investigation was conducted into that abuse. But she was sentenced to 4 months in a young offenders institution for the behaviour that she was doing, and then she came out and the cycle of abuse and arrests continued. I mean, I hope you can tell me that that isn't typical, and I hope you can tell me that that isn't happening now, because I mean, everything that we have heard today about listening to victims, that this is like opposite land, and I would remind everyone, this is not a report from 20 years ago, it's a report that was published yesterday. So what can you tell us to reassure us that you know, apart from the very obvious fact that that's going to discourage people from coming forward and making disclosures if they think they might be then arrested for some minor related crime, how are we making sure that this kind of thing is not common or even happening at all?
So there's been a lot of learning from those particular incidences that we've taken on board, and this is where when we created public protection teams, which was just after that period, we include in there the child support, so child protection, the RASO and the Sapphire teams within those public protection commands, and we had dedicated exploitation officers that deal with child sexual exploitation and child criminal exploitation as well with investigation strands. So that there's been a huge amount of learning, a different approach to how we deal with victims of crime. It is well recognised that children exploited are children victims. So we have moved on, if you like, from those particular examples that were quoted in that particular report.
Can I make the observation, which, I mean, it's an observation I made a moment ago, and I'm very conscious of time chases from very, very short. This has been going on for decades, and at every time there is a major report exposing what's going on, the official response is, oh yes, that was terrible, but that was in the past and it's not happening now. And I hate to paraphrase your response that you've just given to us today, but it does sound a bit like that was terrible, but it's not happening now. I mean, this report came out yesterday, and I take your point that the case studies maybe are from 2017, 2018, which is probably an artifact of how long it takes for those cases to actually go through the system, which we've also spoken about today. But I don't think I'm alone in this room in thinking that I don't have any confidence that we've stopped doing this. So I don't know what you can add to what you've said already. Maybe you want to reflect on it and write to us, or perhaps maybe there'll be a response from the Met to this report, which is, I appreciate, very new. But I just feel that we keep hearing the same things and we keep hearing the same response, and then we have another cycle of hearing the same problems again. I don't know whether, sorry, Rachel from Victim Support, I don't know whether any of this rings true with you, or whether you have seen, whether there really is an improvement. I'd like to hope that there is. You know, I don't want to be completely pessimistic.
I think one of the interesting things that I was reflecting on when you were talking about those case studies is that sometimes young people find it safer to be in institutions than outside, and so will come out and offend again in order to get back into an institution because it's safer than being at home and on the street. But if that is the case in those examples, if that is one of the reasons behind that, then that's useful for us to know. But if not, then I'm with you in terms of thinking about, actually, yes, this has been going on for years, and we don't have a clear picture as to when it's going to stop.
No, you've taken a lot of time, but it's really hard to hear. I think, Commander, you said that you've done a lot of learning, but yesterday we had 2 separate reports which really do not show the Met in a good light at all. And I am devastated to hear that lots of youngsters find it safer to be in an institution than to be hanging around in the streets. I mean, we all ought to take that on board. It's terribly upsetting. We're moving now on to questions from Assembly Member Clark, who is with us virtually.
Thank you, Chair. Can everyone hear me okay? Yep.
Yes, that's fine.
Okay.
Carry on.
Sue, I'll start with you. I think we're picking up on a lot of inconsistencies sort of throughout the day, and I'm worried about the use of domestic violence protection orders and notices, as well as Clare's law, very significantly across London. For instance, in Barking, there were twice as many DVPOs used by the police as in Barnet, although both areas have similar levels of domestic abuse offences. Why is there this inconsistency? Is this something you're alive to? And should we be seeing higher usage of these tools to deal with abuse across London if victims are to receive a better service and to be better protected from repeat victimization?
So there's an awful lot of work that's gone in over the last couple of years around Clare's law, the right to know, the right to ask, about domestic violence, protection orders and notices and other civil legislation to be able to protect the victims. When we've introduced that and we've trained the officers on each BCU, we've asked for either dedicated or single point of contacts to be able to, that we can support and lead through some of the nuances of this legislation so that they do as much as they can in order to protect the victims. When you look at the different BCUs, there is a disparity in the way some apply for some particular type of order more than perhaps another BCU, and we've looked into that to see, you know, is it because one has more cases or they have a trained unit. What we do find is where there are dedicated units established within the BCUs, that's where you get the higher reporting of use of DVPOs, DVPNs, Clare's law, because you've got a dedicated unit. Not every BCU has a dedicated unit. They will have single points of contact, they will have liaison officers, and I know they work very closely with David's team, and his team will support them through the process. But it's a matter of where those resources are put by the BCU commander, and if they're dedicated, we know it works. And that's what I've gone through to the BCU commanders and explained that and said, you know, if you put dedicated resources in there, you're going to have more support for victims. They have to weigh up amongst their many priorities where they want to put their resources, but they always have something. But we have seen, like you've seen, a disparity in the use of some of that. I don't know, David, if you wanted to add to that, because I know your team monitor it.
So it's one of the things we work alongside, monitors. I don't have borough by borough data with me, I'm afraid, but the information I've got is that for the period of January to December of 2021, domestic violence protection orders were over 1,600 applied for and given, which marked a 45% increase on the previous year at just over 1,100. So it's work that we're keen to drive forward, that we're keen to push and have the usage using those dedicated SPOCs. Slightly wider, there's a cultural issue of that putting the victim centre in all of these investigations. And one of the things that comes with is the Victims Code of Practice gives every victim a right to have their individual personal needs assessed at the point of reporting an offence. So at the moment, that's something that's been done through the professional judgment of the officer engaging with that victim. Commander Williams mentioned earlier that my team ran a pilot of a MET standard needs assessment. It was useful information that came out of it, but I think we were a little bit ambitious with that, in that we were asking too many questions too early in the process when the victim wasn't able to really explain in depth. With Claire and her team, we've produced a greatly reduced version, but the goal there is that we identify vulnerable people at that earliest possible interaction with police. We're traditionally very good at identifying vulnerability in sort of, it's hard to find the phrasing, but in a traditionally vulnerable appearing person. in a little old lady in that kind of traditional vulnerability looks like a retired person. It's harder to identify. Vulnerability can very much look like young and angry as much as it can look like elderly and upset, and vulnerability can look like absolutely anything. And the purpose of that needs assessment is to formalise that, to ask the right questions and to ask consistent questions across the Met so that we identify vulnerable people by their true needs rather than by any assumption, anything that we may carry with us. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And Sue, again for you, in response to a written question we asked, we were told that at present, you are not able to provide a figure for levels of attrition in domestic abuse cases in London. It was also said MOPAC are working with the Met to improve what data can be collected. Do you think you will be able to provide domestic abuse attrition data by the end of the year? And how important is it that you have a clear picture of what is happening in this area?
So, sorry, if I'm right in understanding your question, you're asking about the attrition data of domestic abuse.
Yes.
So I don't have that at the moment to know. I know how many. I know we have 11% sanction detection rate, which is not great. But attrition data, it's whether you mean once it's gone through court and then is not successful, is there an attrition there, or are you talking about when it's not sanction detection, charged or caution? Just so I understand what you're asking.
Yeah, the latter, but actually both would be good.
So when it's not charged, when they're not charged or cautioned. So what I was trying to explain earlier on is, yes, sanction detection rates are not great in the Met, and the 11%, and I think I'm right in saying 11% for domestic abuse. But we do have out-of-court disposals, and we do use civil litigation to support the victim. So outcomes are not measured in the same way that we measure sanction detections. But that doesn't mean to say that the victim is completely ignored and not supported through the criminal justice process. Some victims, as we know and we do measure, where they don't want to take the case forward, and that's their choice, and we have to respect that. But what we try to do is make sure that they've got the referral they need for any support, whether that's through London Victim and Witness Care, whether it's through an IDVA service, or whether it's through the local authorities' commissioned services. We will try to support them in the way that they want to be supported. But not everybody ends up with what we would call a criminal justice outcome. And I don't have that data available to hand, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Finally, my last question is to you, Claire. A lot of what we've been talking about today comes back to support and supporting victims, but I'm just wondering what you are doing to reduce the number of repeat victims of domestic abuse and sexual violence in London.
Thank you. Well, I think that question really has to be directed to the Met, because I have to ensure that there's support and justice to victims, and that's the focus. On trying to reduce repeat victimisation, it's really important that the Met and other partners are properly responding to crimes when victims come forward and they get the right justice outcome to avoid future victimisation. So it's very much down to the justice partners' response to that. But what I would say is that in order to prevent victimisation, it's really important there's the right quality support as well, and that the agencies are doing as they should under the Victims Code. So that's why my focus is always there. I also worked really closely with the Stalking Threat Assessment Centre, because around stalking, the way that you reduce repeat victimisation is dealing with the perpetrator's behaviour. Of course, support to the victim is really important, but if you don't deal with the fixation and obsession of the stalker, then what we know with stalking cases is there'll be repeat victimisation again and again. Same with domestic abuse. That's why perpetrator programmes are so critical to preventing repeat victimisation and supporting victims.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to pick up on that, Sue?
Commander, I think she's wondering if you've got anything else
to
say
add
on
to
that.
Sue, before I hand back to the chair.
If you haven't, it's fine.
Sorry, did you just want to repeat that and I'll come back on it?
I was just saying, I mean, it was only that Claire said that you may be better placed to answer that question. So I was just asking if you had anything to add to what Claire responded with.
It was basically, what are you doing to reduce the number of repeat victims of domestic abuse and sexual violence in London?
Yeah.
Is there anything quick you could say that you haven't already said?
Yeah, I think I mentioned that earlier on, some of the work that we were doing around repeat victims of sexual assault and abuse.
You did, okay. Thank you.
That's all right. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Assembly Member. Right, we're going now to Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, to the Commander Williams. Commander Williams used to be my borough commander, so did a very good job too. So, what are you doing? Oh, sorry, can you provide an update on the Met's current capacity and capability to undertake digital forensic examination, and what effect is this having on the time it takes to process cases? Do it again. Right. So, can you provide an update on the Mayor's current capacity and capability to undertake digital forensic examination, and what effect is this having on the time to process cases?
I think the Commissioner mentioned at a previous meeting that she's invested £11 million into forensic digital submissions and examinations. So this, once that will start moving forward, we hope that the timescales for receiving the results on them will be much quicker and able to support a victim going through the criminal justice process. We know with some of the forensic submissions, if you have a phone that is locked, it could take anything from to open it 6 months to a year, 18 months. These can be really tricky devices that we currently have that require expert people to be able to unlock, whether it's computers, phones, to get that sort of evidence. So by putting more money into the system, we should be able to shorten the timeframes down. I don't have what that might look like. I think that's something our forensic directors will probably have a little bit more information on. But I've been working quite closely with some of the forensic managers, so at the point of when somebody is in detention and we're building a case, to get them to have that conversation with the officer to estimate roughly how long they think it will be and prioritise those submissions so that we can build a case as effectively as possible, so that we can put it to the CPS to get whatever the charging decision might be, and then consequently get it to the court with all the available evidence required. So by working with our forensic team, they're supporting the frontline officers and the investigating officers in that process. But we've also, as you probably know, we've also got the digital forensics hubs being put on every single BCU, and the VIDO units that deal with video images. So there's a lot of work in that digital space to support the investigation and ultimately support the victim with a quicker case that will go to court and hopefully with a better outcome for the victim.
Thank you very much. I do think my last question's already been answered, actually.
Yes, it has. Thank you. Very, very quickly, I mean it.
Thank you very much, Chair. Really appreciate that. I very quickly wanted to go back to something that the Victims Commissioner said about harassment and stalking being regarded as harassment and recorded as harassment by the police. I would like to hear from the CPS of Chris on this, because this is a legislative issue. Why aren't these cases being recorded in the way that they should be, which of course helps victims?
Absolutely, a very good question. First of all, we are ensuring that our prosecutors are aware of using the proper legislation in terms of whether it's stalking, harassment or coercive and controlling behaviour. We rolled out last year, just by Christmas time, 16 days of action in terms of domestic abuse primarily. And one of the key subjects, we had guest speakers to come and talk to all our prosecutors across London and to talk about ensuring that our policies are followed correctly and applied correctly. Much of this all depends, and we work very closely again with the Met in ensuring that we have the evidence that we need to be able to prove these cases. That, you know, it's all very well having legislation. You have to have the evidence in order to prove the case. So a lot of that involves work with the officers, ensuring the cases are built and the strongest possible cases are built for us. And on domestic abuse, I did put my hand up. I just wanted to mention something, but I'll touch upon it now if I quickly may. It's in relation to evidence-led prosecutions. Not all cases with victims and domestic abuse cases go ahead, and we know that because the attrition is very high. We do prosecute a number of cases where it's based on the evidence alone without the victim. And so the officers and us working together are trying to build cases where in some cases we will do our best to prosecute evidence-led cases. So without a victim having to go through the additional trauma of having to give evidence at court.
Thank you, Chris. As ex-CPS, I know exactly how the process works. Thank you. But what I would like to know is that when the police come to you, the Met come to you with, you know, we think this is harassment and this is the evidence. Why is it, and what seems to be happening is that the CPS and the lawyers in the CPS aren't saying, well, actually, this could be regarded as stalking and it fits under legislation. Why is that not working?
Well,
very briefly.
I can't say it's not working in all cases.
Well, the Commissioner is saying that there's work there that needs to be done.
There is work to be done. I don't dispute that. And I said to you already that we've rolled out constant training. We've got 16 days of action that we just had only recently to reiterate the point that when police come to us seeking charging advice, as they have to do in all domestic abuse cases, that prosecutors, if we've not been provided the evidence, it's a reasonable line of inquiry. We ask for further evidence to be gathered so we can actually build the strongest case in order to prosecute it.
So the reassurance that I'm looking for is that stalking is being considered when someone comes to you with harassment.
We've got lead prosecutors whose responsibility is to be the single point of contact. And they deliver training for our prosecutors. Some of it is about reiteration. It's about our legal guidance being correctly applied. And for us, that's senior managers like myself and others to ensure we hold case management panels, to ensure that we go through the cases to make sure correct charges are proceeded with.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Right, that brings us to the end. I would like to thank our guests for attending this meeting and for their answers to our questions. And I do apologise to everybody for the IT issues we've had during the meeting. Can I ask the committee to note the report in the discussion? Thank you. Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the work programme and the additional activity listed in the report? Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for Wednesday, the 23rd of February 2022 at 10 a.m. I have no other urgent business, which concludes today's meeting. Thank you.